This story begins on one of the busy streets of Korea. Locals were walking around the city, talking about how their day went. One blond man, talking on the phone, smiled widely as he talked to his friend about his director and his promotion. Raising his eyebrows, he noted that the area was in a terrible state, as only homeless people lived there. Meanwhile, a man with long dark hair and tattered clothes made his way through the crowd. He froze and clenched his fists, mentally wondering where he was and what kind of fetid air surrounded him. The noise from all sides was enough to deafen anyone. He clenched his fists, convinced that this chaotic place was nothing like the OK Kingdom he once knew. The hero was still not sure what this place was, although he was sure that it was not an illusion. Everything seemed too bright and real. The protagonist knew that he needed to find out where he ended up. The man stood in the middle of a busy street, stunned by the surrounding noise. The thing is, the main character is the Flame Emperor. Everyone who ever called him Yomru was considered doomed to die. Those who had faced him in battle had no doubt that he was indeed the Flame Emperor. He felt no pity and shed no tears. Although he had taken the form of a man, he had not been one for a very long time. Wherever he went, a trail of blood was left behind him, and the cries of the fallen were heard. No one dared to follow in his footsteps, for he had become nothing other than the god of death. The protagonist killed the supreme master of the dark path, Murim, and forced the leader of the heavenly demon cult to kneel. For such a feat, he was hailed as the pinnacle of martial prowess, revered by both light and dark warriors, and so he became known as the god of martial arts. Now the protagonist remembered how he sat on the top of a rocky slope looking at the village. Relaxing, he took a sip from his glass, thinking that his past now seemed like a dream. It seemed to him that life offered nothing but bloodshed and violence. Suddenly, a voice came from somewhere nearby. A young girl closed her eyes and smiled warmly, urging him to admire the beauty surrounding them. Sitting under a tree, the man admitted that he did not understand whether she really saw beauty in simple flower petals. In response, the girl smiled at the flower in her hand. For her, joy was laughter and dancing for no reason. She handed the man a bright yellow flower, expressing her faith that perhaps someday he would understand. Until then, she was ready to share her joy with him. The guy carefully studied the flower in his hand. The hero realized that meeting this girl melted his once hardened heart. Suddenly he understood what it meant to laugh and cry. Yomru reflected on how he never expected a life full of chaos and destruction to bring him any joy. He wondered if she had found her own happiness, and wondered what he himself should do. Perhaps he should strive for happiness, or perhaps he should not get too entangled in such fleeting emotions. The hero watched the rose petals fall in front of his face with a slight frown, wondering in his mind if he had managed to achieve eternal immortality. A sudden gust of wind sent the fallen petals flying high into the air, a whirlwind of pink leaves rising over the rocky slope. Now Yomru lay on the ground with his eyes closed, until he finally opened them. He could not understand where he was. Sitting in the cave, he turned his head, surprised by what he saw. The protagonist raised his eyebrows, believing that he had just been on the path to immortality. At that moment, he wondered if someone had put an illusion on him and he himself was not aware of it. He sat up and peered into the darkness ahead, deciding that he had to run no matter what. He needed to figure out what was going on. Suddenly he froze, his eyes widening as the one-eyed monster's head appeared behind him. Turning around in fear, he gathered his courage to accept the fight. Meanwhile, outside nearby, a portal was pulsating. A command voice announced that Alpha Team should enter the portal. If anything suspicious happened, they were to report it immediately. Their mission was to conduct reconnaissance and return alive. The boy raised his eyebrows as he looked around, thinking that for a Class A portal, it was eerily quiet here. The girl walking next to him with a brightly shining flashlight asked if he really slept during the briefing. After all, everyone knew that the smartest monsters hid in Class A portals. She frowned, noting that it had been 5 years since the incident in which the guards from Group Zero had died under similar circumstances. The girl remembered that these people had dared to penetrate deep into the portal, where a swarm of monsters awaited them in the darkness. None of them survived. One of the guys raised his eyebrows awkwardly and scratched the back of his head, muttering an apology. Then suddenly the girl frowned and demanded that no one move. The guys froze in place for a moment. Suddenly a loud roar echoed through the cave, shaking everything around them. The girl looked forward, worried by the fact that she hadn't felt the presence of the creature at all. She wondered at what point it had appeared. The Class A monster had been hiding, pretending to be dead. One of the guys opened his eyes wide, urgently attracting the commander's attention. The girl moved forward, ordering the others to retreat. She herself would hold the monster at bay. Ahead lay the lifeless body of a giant cyclops with a gaping hole in its chest. The girl's eyes widened in obvious confusion. At that moment, the squad was contacted by radio, reporting the discovery of multiple corpses, Class A Cyclops and Class B monsters. The girl walked closer to the hole in his chest. Noticing that all the high-level monsters had been killed, she explained that they would continue scouting and promised to report back once the mission was completed. At that moment, a guy approached the girl and said that he had already passed the information to headquarters. He then asked if it was possible that the monsters were fighting among themselves. The commander stared ahead, noting that even if that was the case, the Cyclops would not have received such injuries from lower-level monsters. The boy assumed that another guild was hunting in the area, especially given the recent trend of guilds only targeting high-level portals. The girl rubbed her chin thoughtfully. She wondered out loud if there really could be a guild in South Korea that hunted wherever it wanted, and no one knew about it. Meanwhile, the main character emerged from the portal, dragging a bright stream of energy behind him. Yomru frowned and looked around, mentally wondering where he was. He remembered that when he first opened his eyes, he found himself in a cave full of monsters. He wondered why such weak creatures that he could defeat with one blow attacked him at all. Coming out of the cave, he saw tall buildings in the distance, and the ground beneath him was covered with sand. Yomru frowned again, silently wondering what these ruins were, and if there was any life left in them. Kneeling down next to the skeleton, he took off his tattered clothes and put on a torn t-shirt, thinking about how he had once again landed in an unfamiliar, lifeless place. All around him was dust, ruins, and weathered remains. No trace of life anywhere. At this moment, the hero raised his eyebrows in surprise and looked away. He frowned, suspecting that this was the work of the sorcerer he had encountered earlier. The celestial demon cult came to mind. Their mages used forbidden spells, and what he was feeling now seemed eerily similar. The protagonist believed that he could cleanse the area of such corrupted magic, though he also believed that it would be wiser to examine his surroundings before releasing such a power. Looking into the distance, he came to the conclusion that his first priority was to get out of here. Dark energy began to swirl around his body. His attention was drawn to a tall building in the distance, and he decided to head there, noting that the concentration of black energy seemed weakest in that direction. Meanwhile, the story shifts to a small restaurant, and the news reported that the Korea Awakened Association has yet to release an official position on the incident. Meanwhile, in both America and China, countries with their own awakened zero-level beings, discussions have already begun regarding the mysterious portal. At one of the tables, a girl raised her hand to ask when they would be served. The senior manager of the Yangchunggak restaurant, Sarah, smiled while holding a tray of plates and said she was on her way. The girl closed her eyes and smiled as Sarah placed plates in front of them, wishing the heroes a pleasant appetite. Suddenly, the door of the cafe creaked open and a guy in glasses walked inside. Sarah immediately noticed him, noting that he hadn't come in for a long time. The director of the Awakened Association, Buck, waved his hand casually, asking for a plate of what Sarah had prepared. The girl came closer, noticing that he looked exhausted, and asked how he was feeling. The man sat up and mentioned that another portal had opened in the Deadlands. According to him, the guilds were currently fighting fiercely for territory, and they were burning out from overexertion trying to contain the conflict. Buck explained that they were under enormous pressure. Everyone was hunting for this portal, mainly due to the recent surge in demand for magic stones. The death toll during raids had increased dramatically. At that moment, the restaurant manager, Sam, approached them, frowned, holding a tray in his hands, and noticed that the portals were inexorably increasing in number. The tank sighed tiredly, admitting that the constant load was killing them. He noted that while the situation was difficult, it also had its benefits. The increased supply of magic stones meant that their market price would fall. However, Sam put his hands on his hips, insisting that the appearance of so many monsters did not bring them joy. The number of customers dropped sharply. Buck smirked and asked who dared to leave their home in such dangerous times. At that moment, the courier's iron suitcase fell to the floor with a crash, and another man entered the establishment, holding out his phone, explaining with disappointment that another portal had opened, and that he could no longer work in such conditions. Sam, trying to remain calm, asked him not to raise his voice in front of the clients, reminding him that his salary had already been doubled. The young man, clearly irritated, closed his eyes and turned away, wondering if Sam really believed his life was worth so little. He repeated that this could not go on any longer. Then he demanded either a pay raise or a replacement courier. Sam, trying to defuse the situation, asked how he could do that, noting that times were hard for everyone. The guy annoyed that Sam wasn't listening to him at all, since he was risking his life. With a slight smile, Sam turned to Sarah, and mentioned that it was time to pick up Hannah. He asked if she could take care of it. The girl looked at him in surprise, and noted that it was not time yet. However, the man insisted. Then Sarah said that she understood, and promised to return soon. Sam then rubbed his chin thoughtfully, thinking about how many people were becoming increasingly worried about the constant appearance of new portals. It was now incredibly difficult to find willing workers. He thought that he had only recently settled in this place, and he did not want to leave it. The man wondered why it had become almost impossible to find a decent courier these days. Meanwhile, the hero frowned, noting how different everything here was from his homeland. And yet there were similarities. Many of the people in this land seemed to have an inner energy. Among the crowd, whose bodies were glowing with energy of various colors, he noticed a woman and a little girl standing to the side. He thought the girl's energy stood out in particular, pure and bright. The man watched her smile and thought about how pure and radiant her energy felt. He began to wonder if there was something more to this girl, something hidden within her that made her stand out from the crowd. Suddenly, Sarah closed her eyes, noting that the wind had become too strong. A gust of wind tore the bandage off Hannah's head and carried it somewhere outside. She frowned pitifully and extended her hand, but the woman warned her that chasing after him was too dangerous. But Hannah, frowning, extended her hand again and ran to the crosswalk, declaring that her father had given her the armband. She picked up the blindfold and smiled proudly, thinking she had caught it. At that moment, a large blue car screeched to a halt behind her. At that very moment, the bandage slipped out of her hands. Sarah clutched her chest in horror as the car sped towards her daughter. But at that moment, someone's hand reached out to the girl. The protagonist rushed forward and grabbed the child, saving her just in time. The girl looked up at the man who was holding her tightly, still shaking. Her mother screamed in panic. The girl looked into the eyes of her savior with wide eyes. The man realized that she was seconds away from being hit. He asked if she was okay. At that moment, Sarah approached them, calling out to her daughter. The girl immediately threw herself into her mother's arms. Bowing low, the woman expressed her gratitude, admitting that she had no idea how to repay him for saving her child's life. The hero assured her that he did not need anything in return. He was just glad that the child was safe. Hannah looked at him and smiled warmly. Then the man thought about how he had directed energy into the child's nervous system, and believed that everything would be okay with her. Sarah then asked if she should help him get to the hospital. But the hero raised his hand and assured her that he was okay. At that moment, his stomach growled loudly, and Sarah and Hannah's eyes widened in surprise. The man lowered his head in slight confusion, trying to remember when he had last eaten. A memory came to him. Before coming here, he was sitting on the edge of a rocky slope and eating a single dumpling. Then Hannah smiled and pulled down his shirt, telling him that her father was a cook and inviting him to have dinner with them. Sarah closed her eyes and smiled softly, saying that since he had saved her daughter, the least she could do was make sure he didn't go hungry. Although Yomru protested that he had not done it for the reward, his stomach began to rumble again, this time even louder. The girl giggled, and he finally admitted that he would not refuse such an offer. Soon they came to a small cafe with a red sign and lanterns hanging above the entrance. The tables inside were mostly empty. Suddenly Sam screamed, shocked by the news that Hannah had almost been hit by a car. His face contorted with panic as he leaned over to check on his daughter, asking if she was hurt and if they should go to the hospital. But Sarah calmly explained that their daughter was fine and pointed to the man who saved her, mentioning that she had invited him to eat to show her gratitude. Sam's eyes widened in surprise as he rushed towards the stranger, shaking his hand and thanking him for saving Hannah. He insisted that the man could order whatever he liked from the menu. Hannah then raised her hand and reminded everyone that her father always said that you can't sit at the table dirty. Yomru looked at his dusty and torn clothes and frowned. The restaurant owner asked if he wanted to take a shower while the food was being prepared, and the protagonist gratefully agreed, saying that he didn't want to bother anyone, but he wouldn't mind freshening up. Soon Sam handed the man a clean blue t-shirt from the hanger. The guy thanked him. Sam smiled, noting that he had put on a bit of weight lately, so the clothes wouldn't fit him anymore anyway. Considering their similar builds, he thought they would fit Yomru well. In the shower, the hero noticed unusually bright walls. He wondered for a moment where the source of water was. The well. Then he turned his attention to the toilet, and then called the owner. The man looked up in response, and the protagonist pointed to the toilet, explaining that there didn't seem to be enough water in the well. Sam raised his eyebrows in confusion, asking what kind of well Yomru was referring to. The hero's reflection shimmered in the water, as he noted that he wouldn't be able to wash himself using that much water. A shocked Sam widened his eyes, and explained that what he meant was not a well, but a toilet. The guy turned to him and asked if he really meant to say that the place was a toilet. Sam confirmed that it was indeed. explaining that the toilet used the same water as the tap. The man raised his eyebrows in surprise and turned his attention to the shower. He explained that when a certain lever was turned, water would start to flow. The guy asked if he was doing it right, just as the shower head started wriggling under the pressure of the water. Sam screamed, begging someone to catch her quickly. Yomru, now frowning and covering his face with his hands, asked what kind of snake was spitting water at him. Kneeling down at the bathroom door, Sam announced that the test was finally over. The protagonist wiped his face with a towel and declared that he now felt good. He sincerely thanked the owner. Turning his head, the man admitted that he hadn't meant to be rude, but he couldn't help but ask where the stranger had come from. It was as if he had never seen a bathroom in his life. Then Yomru frowned, trying his best to come up with a suitable explanation. When Sam and Sarah heard his explanation, they both widened their eyes in surprise, asking if he had really lost his memory. The main character admitted that only fragments of his memories remained. He could not remember at all how he ended up here. The man, noticing his torn clothes, noted that now it made sense. He assumed that the cave the stranger had emerged from was actually one of the portals. The guy frowned at the mention of portals. He remembered the glowing stream of energy, asking what portals were. Sam explained that these were mysterious doors to other dimensions that began to open in their world. To this day, no one truly understood them, as the doors appeared and disappeared without warning. Sam added that sometimes people were pulled into these portals, and in order to survive, they were forced to survive alone until the door closed again. He noted that victims often lost their memory, and in severe cases they could even forget the basic skills of civilized life. The man continued, saying that such people are called isolationists. Then Sam smiled softly and promised to explain in more detail later. But for now they needed to eat before the food got cold. Yomru frowned slightly and smiled shyly, thanking them and asking what kind of dish it was. He looked at the plate in front of him, feeling uneasy about the strange color of the dish. Something about it made him wary. A memory flashed through his mind. His hands scooping up the water, the color of the dish reminded him of his dedication. There were dead fish floating in the muddy pond. The grass around was strewn with bottles and garbage. Little Yomru looked in horror at his own reflection. He remembered being in a pit of stagnant water, forced to drink dirty, blood-stained water filled with decay and death to survive. At this moment, Hannah looked at him and asked why he wasn't eating. She wondered if he didn't like the black noodles. The protagonist, still stunned, raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked how could he eat something like that. The girl reached for his plate with her utensils and explained that he needed to stir the noodles and wrap them around his fork. Hannah then smiled and held out a fork to him, encouraging him to try it. The boy raised the fork of noodles to his mouth, and Yomru's eyes widened. Despite the strange appearance, the hero closed his eyes and began to chew diligently. The taste surprised him. It was not at all what he expected. In fact, it was excellent. Better than anything he had ever eaten before. Sam smiled and scratched the back of his head, apologizing that he couldn't offer anything better. They simply didn't have any more food at home. Sarah smiled too, promising that next time they would treat him to something even more delicious. The protagonist frowned, then politely asked for another plate of the same dish. Hannah noted with delight that he had gotten dirty again. Sam chuckled and told him that he could eat as much as he wanted. Later, Yomru stood at the entrance to the establishment, expressing heartfelt gratitude for the hearty meal. Sam looked at him with a kind expression and replied that there was no need for gratitude. At that moment, the hero noticed a piece of paper stuck to the glass of the shop window. Interested, he asked what was written there. It turned out that it was an ad for a courier. Sam explained that they needed someone to deliver food. They had couriers before, but they all demanded too much money, so now they urgently looked for a replacement. The hero then asked if this meant that the courier would be given a room. Sam confirmed this, adding that there weren't many people willing to do this job these days. The hero's eyes lit up. He realized that since he couldn't return to his world yet, he needed to settle down somewhere. This opportunity presented itself at the most opportune time. He could work, and at the same time learn how the new world works. Then the protagonist asked if he could get a job as a courier for them. Sam's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked if he was serious. The man rubbed the back of his head and admitted that they would have been happy to have him. But there were legal complications with hiring an isolationist. Then Sarah smiled warmly and extended her hand, reminding everyone that the boy had saved Hannah. She offered to help him, mentioning that she had heard that a citizen could serve as a guarantor for an isolationist. Sam raised his eyebrows uncertainly, but Sarah, hugging her daughter, declared that this meeting was not an accident. It was fate. She offered to vouch for the boy so that he could become their courier. The man then admitted that she was right. Such a procedure did exist. And turning to Yomru, Sam announced that he was ready to vouch for him. Touched, the hero pounded his fist into his palm and promised to do everything possible. He then introduced himself as Kanso and stated that he was 35 years old, at which point the couple screamed in shock. Sam chuckled and shook his hand, exclaiming that they were the same age, although the guy looked much younger. Because of this, he suggested that they talk in an informal setting. The guy agreed, saying that he would work hard for him. They shook hands firmly. Then the hero remembered how the girl from his past life suggested calling him Kanso. She smiled, saying that this name would remind him of the need to smile more often. The protagonist took her hand and smiled softly, admitting that she wasn't very good at coming up with names. The girl smiled warmly, explaining that she liked the name because it meant a wide smile. Kanso raised his eyebrows in interest and smiled back. Taking her hand, he stepped forward and agreed to wear that name with pride. As night fell, the crows settled on the wires and suddenly they began to caw wildly, excited by the surge of magical energy. Meanwhile, the protagonist sat in his room, channeling energy from his chest. And when he finished, he slowly opened his eyes. Sitting in the lotus position in the middle of the semi-dark room, he silently reflected on how this world seemed to be filled to the brim with pure energy. Looking around, Kanso thought that the people here had many everyday objects whose purpose he could hardly understand. And looking at the kitchen utensils, he thought to himself that this was truly a world of wonders. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. He turned around to see Sam walking inside, looking completely shocked to find the protagonist sitting on the floor with his legs crossed. At a loss for words, the man simply stared at him. Kanso then stood up and greeted him, wishing him a good morning. Sam, still confused, asked why he was sitting in the dark with his arms crossed over his chest. Kanso admitted that he simply couldn't find the lamp, which explained the lack of light. Sam, now even more confused than before, made a note that he would need to teach his guest how to use the light switch. With that, he walked over to the wall and pressed the switch, explaining that pressing the button would light up the room, the sudden light causing Kanso to widen his eyes in surprise. At that moment, Sarah came in and commented on how early the hero was already up. Tying his apron, she greeted him. Kanso turned to her and asked if she was going to the kitchen to start cooking. Sam, heading towards the kitchen, explained that they hadn't started yet, but since they were opening the establishment soon, there was still a lot of work to do. Soon Sarah joined her husband and they quietly discussed their tasks while Kanso remained seated at the table. After a moment, he looked up and offered his help. Sam looked at him with slight distrust and asked if he really wanted to help, adding that the guest could still rest a little. He admitted that he felt awkward being asked to come to work so early. Then Kanso extended his hand and insisted that he simply wanted to repay their kindness. Sam, holding a frying pan, stepped towards him and asked if he could help with the cleaning. He handed him a vacuum cleaner, explaining that the device would make the process easier. Watching the young man awkwardly hold the vacuum cleaner, Sam began to explain how it worked, that pressing a button activated the suction, and that they were supposed to move it across the floor like a mop. However, before he finished explaining, the vacuum cleaner suddenly sucked in a strand of Kanso's long hair. Sam turned around with a forced smile, mentioning that their daughter sometimes helped with the cleaning, but then let out a cry of shock as he asked what was going on. Kanso's hair was disheveled in all directions. A worried expression was frozen on his face. Sam muttered with a heavy sigh that although the vacuum cleaner was quite old, it was still powerful, so it should be used with caution. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and asked if Kanso could handle the task. Without waiting for an answer, he went into the kitchen, saying that he needed to start cooking, and that I would leave the rest of the cleaning to him. The protagonist nodded and turned back to the device, whispering under his breath. He admitted that while he needed to clean it, this tool was much more dangerous than expected. Then, as an idea struck him, his eyes lit up, and he asked himself if he should try using magic instead. He then raised his hand, which immediately began to glow with magical energy. He clenched it into a fist, concentrating hard, raising it higher. He released a controlled gust of wind that swept across the room. As his eyes lit up with power, he collected all the dust and dirt in the apartment, lifting it up to the ceiling. Then, with a sharp movement, Kanso created one large lump of garbage, and with magical precision launched it into the trash can. Satisfied, he looked around and noted that the dust was gone, but the cleaning was not yet complete. Raising his hand again, he scooped up some water from a nearby bucket. The water danced around his palm, sparkling as if lit from within. Clenching his fist once more, he directed the stream of water across the room, cleaning every surface. In one smooth motion, he even washed the ceiling. Resting his hand on his hip, Kanso concluded that the cleaning had gone quite well. Just then, Sam returned and called out to him. The protagonist extended his hand towards the room and explained that he had cleaned it up in his own way. The man then asked how he did it. Sam's face contorted as he screamed, demanding to know if it was Kanso's ability. The hero, a little confused, asked if he meant control over water. Then Sam nodded, still confused. Kanso asked what made that so unusual. Sam started pointing a shaking finger at him, demanding to know if he really was a high-ranking awakened. The protagonist frowned and asked what exactly an awakened was. Sam explained that awakened was a term for those who had displayed superpowers, a phenomenon that began 25 years ago when portals to other dimensions first opened. He added that these abilities are also called aura, and those who possess them can wield powers such as telekinesis or elemental magic. Sam elaborated further, noting that a person's control over their aura determined their class, and the higher the class, the higher the person's social status and influence. He nervously wiped away the beads of sweat that had appeared, and admitted that he had once worked as a loader among the awakened individuals, but he had never in his life seen anyone manipulate aura with such skill as Kanso. He then clenched his fist and declared that a man with Kanso's talent should not waste his time in a small restaurant. Instead, he insisted, he should become a hunter in a guild where he could live with dignity. In response, Kanso muttered that he had no intention of becoming a hunter. Sam then shouted that Kanso simply didn't remember how harsh life was in this country, and that high-level awakened people lived like nobles. Taking a step closer, the protagonist replied that Sam's words only made him less inclined to become a hunter. He said that in his past life, he had tasted wealth and honor, but realized too late that it was all fleeting. Sam spread his hands in disbelief, asking if the boy was regaining his memory. But Kanso, with a look of disappointment on his face, admitted that this was not a return of memory. He had once lived in a completely different world. He explained that he had once fallen into oblivion and woke up inside one of the very portals that the man had spoken of earlier. Having escaped from this place, he headed to the city, driven by the desire to find pure energy. During the conversation, the young man recalled the moment when he saved Hannah, who was almost hit by an iron cart. Sam looked at him with a mixture of concern and admiration. Then Kanso, frowning guiltily, apologized, admitting that he never intended to deceive anyone, and believed that he should have told the truth from the very beginning. With tears in his eyes, Sam said that the young man had clearly been through a lot, and must have been terrified to find himself in such a completely alien world. In response, the protagonist hesitantly asked if the man believed his story. Sam then put both his hands on the boy's shoulders, and assured him that if he were in his place, he wouldn't be able to share everything right away either. He added that they could tell others that Kanso was an isolationist and suggested that he consider getting tested for superpowers. He explained that taking the test could greatly improve his life from now on. Meanwhile, in the Awakened Support Department, in the first group office, a young man fell asleep at his desk, his head on the table. Suddenly, a girl entered the room and loudly called his name. The frightened man, Jin, suddenly woke up and began to adjust his glasses in a daze. The girl looked at him with concern and asked if he really had been working all night again, warning that such a habit would eventually wear him out. The girl from the Group 2 inspection department, Molly, raised an eyebrow and asked what the hell was going on that kept him working around the clock. Stretching, Jin explained that this was all because of Case A-0128109. He admitted that he had no idea where to even begin. Molly then handed him a stack of papers and told him to take a look. She already knew that he was still looking for the elusive Awakened Class 0. Jin adjusted his glasses again, confused, and looked at the paper. His eyes widened. It was the number he had just given. Molly informed him that the chairman had ordered the case closed. As he continued to look through the documents, she repeated in a firmer tone that the order to terminate the investigation had been signed by the chairman himself. Hearing this, Jin's expression darkened as he desperately asked if the chairman really wanted them to give up on searching for the Awakened Class 0. Then, unable to contain himself, he threw the papers on the table, clutched his head, and screamed, demanding to know how this could have happened. Molly, who was watching him, calmly reminded him that it was the chairman's decision. Then Jin grabbed his head tighter and exclaimed that for the first time in the history of their country, they had a real chance to discover the awakening of their own zero class. The girl said that even if they had continued the investigation, they still would not have found the person in question. She added, looking at Jin, that everyone already knew about this case, and no one was even sure whether it was possible to kill such a person with bare hands. Then she reminded him that all the damage had been done by one person. Molly wondered anxiously if the perpetrator had even been human. Jin ran his hands through his hair, and, although confused, insisted that it was definitely a person. He stared at the monitor, and explained that he had analyzed every wound inflicted on the monsters inside the gate, and all evidence pointed to one human fist. He admitted that he rechecked the data several times, and each time came to the same result. Jin added that this was their only chance. If they could find this awakened one, Korea would finally take its rightful place among the allied nations. Molly, who had been listening intently, asked hesitantly what they would do if they looked and still couldn't catch him. Then Jin crossed his arms over his chest and firmly replied that there was nothing to be afraid of. They would find him no matter what. Hearing this, the girl agreed, noting that such a person really could not be stopped. With a wave of her hand, she declared that she would deal with the chairman herself and told Jean to continue the investigation as quickly as possible. The genie jumped up from his chair and thanked her with visible relief. Then he asked if she was really leaving on business and what her plans were for lunch. Then Molly stopped and mentioned that she had an appointment, but was also planning to have lunch with her younger brother. They hadn't seen each other for quite some time. Then Molly added that if he hadn't eaten yet, he could join them. Adjusting his sleeves, Jean declined with a grin, saying he would just grab something from the store and eat at his desk. Then he asked what Molly herself would eat. She answered vaguely that she didn't know yet. She mentioned that her brother told her that there was a well-known restaurant nearby, although she did not ask what kind of food they served there. Hearing this, Jean added with a grin that he knew exactly what place their department head, Buck, would recommend. Molly said that her brother also mentioned that the department head recommended this place to him. Jean looked at her in surprise and concluded that it was probably the restaurant that Mr. Buck loved so much. Then he asked if she remembered the name. Soon after, Molly's turned out to be a restaurant with a sign called the Spring Pavilion. A few minutes later, her brother Morty came and explained that he had long wanted to have lunch with her there, as jjajangmyeon was simply exceptional. Struck by this name, the girl asked in confusion if he really meant it. The young man asked if his sister really didn't like jjajangmyeon. In response, Molly gently placed her hand on his shoulder and assured him that she was simply happy to have lunch with her brother. In fact, she loved jjajangmyeon. Smiling involuntarily, she added to herself that she had simply hoped that he would take her to an elite restaurant at least once, and not to ordinary establishments. But after a moment's thought, she stepped forward and admitted that she was dying of hunger. As they entered, she looked at her brother and said that she was genuinely interested in hearing about the restaurant that the head of their department had recommended, adding that the food must be extraordinary for him to speak so highly of it. A moment later, a warm and kind female voice greeted them with a cheerful greeting. Sarah looked at the guests and gestured for them to sit down. Without taking her eyes off them, she explained that it was a self-service restaurant and that they should follow her. Molly, slightly confused by this format, simply nodded. Sarah handed them the menu and politely asked them to call her as soon as they had decided on their order. Molly, a little skeptical, asked her brother if the restaurant was really that good and why it seemed so empty. In response, Morty smiled and gently told her to stop worrying. He assured her that the food there was really good, handing her the menu. He added that he was sure she would like it. A moment later, Molly asked if he had decided what to order yet. The guy, smirking, said he had settled on jjajangmyeon. Molly, still a little unsure, said she would try it too. Morty then raised his hand and beckoned to the waitress, who came up to them with a notepad in her hand and asked if they were ready to order. Morty asked for 1 serving of sweet and sour pork and playfully winked at her and called her madam. Then he asked for 2 more servings of jjajangmyeon. Molly, caught off guard, was so surprised that she almost spat out her water. Then Sarah covered her face with her hands in embarrassment and added that she would add an extra portion of dumplings on the house. Molly then looked at her brother with a smirk and teased him by saying that he had become very outgoing. Morty simply replied that it was just being polite. Turning to his sister, he asked how things had been going for her lately, especially considering how chaotic things must have been after the A-class portal incident. Pouring herself a glass of water, Molly sighed and admitted that the headache was the least of her worries after the ordeal. Her brother, curious, asked her to tell him more. The girl then took a sip and explained that this incident had attracted a lot of attention. If the association couldn't find the only O-class that had awakened in many years, their reputation would be irreparably damaged. In response, the chairman ordered the case to be closed. She then asked if Morty remembered her colleague Jean from the support department, noting that he had vowed to find the awakened human no matter what. Morty smiled sympathetically, and noted that it was clearly a difficult time for his sister. Molly admitted that while the easiest thing to do would have been to drop the case, she couldn't pass up the opportunity. After all, both she and Jean were making things difficult for themselves now. Suddenly Molly felt a strange sensation on her back. Her eyes widened and turned red as she turned around sharply. Morty, noticing her reaction, looked at her with concern and asked what happened. Molly noticed a suspicious man at a table in the back. She stared at him, convinced that he had an incredibly powerful aura coming from him. She wondered why she hadn't felt it before. Just a minute ago there had been a surge of energy. She frowned, her thoughts racing. Her ability to detect auras had definitely affected the man, and in just a second, a huge amount of power had burst out of him. But somehow, he had hidden it again just as quickly. She then thought that if she wasn't mistaken, this man should be at least an A-class awakened. His strength could potentially rival that of the O-class awakens they were hunting. At that moment, Sarah approached their table and, smiling warmly, announced the arrival of their order. She placed plates in front of them and wished them a pleasant appetite. Morty thanked her and excitedly asked his sister to look at the food. Then Molly looked at the table and admitted, somewhat stunned, that everything did indeed look delicious. She started eating and tried to shake off her anxiety, thinking that perhaps hunger was playing a cruel joke on her. After all, no one would believe that an awakened O-class would hide in a restaurant like this. She continued eating her noodles, then turned to her brother with a loud scream, asking if he had gone completely crazy. Morty, shocked but amused, looked up and asked if she liked the dish. Molly exclaimed in delight, wondering aloud why her brother had never brought her to this establishment before. The food, she said, was amazing. Morty chuckled and said that she scared him, then added that he knew from the start that she would like it. Meanwhile, Kanso watched them. While Molly was loudly proclaiming how delicious the food was, the protagonist silently picked up Hannah's teddy bear and thought that one of the guests seemed to have an exceptional sense of aura. Observing the boys, he came to the conclusion that their energy signatures were indeed different, but both could be considered masters. Kanso then reminded himself that these were beings known as awakened. He had to remain on guard and not reveal the level of his own aura. The next day he was cleaning again using his magic power. When the hero finished, everything around him was sparkling. Although he was still dissatisfied, he admitted to himself that for now, the result was quite enough. The boy remembered looking into the toilet after his first arrival in this world, realizing that he was still adjusting to life here. The kind couple who owned this establishment had already taught him a lot. He also remembered the watering can from which water was spraying in all directions, and he chuckled to himself, noting that there was still a lot he didn't know. Touching his chin thoughtfully, Kanso reminded himself that he didn't need to rush. Everything would come in time, but first, he needed to learn more about the awakened. Suddenly, a loud growl was heard from outside. The protagonist's eyes widened, and he turned towards the source of the sound. As it turned out, it was coming from a motorcycle. Without hesitation, Kanso ran out into the street, wondering what kind of creature could make such a sound. To his surprise, he was immediately greeted by a man. It was Sam, holding the helmet in his hands. Sam noticed that the guy had arrived just in time. He had something he wanted to show him. The protagonist looked at the man curiously and asked about the sound, wondering if it came from the strange object Sam was holding. Sam nodded in acknowledgement, then pointed to the car and explained that it was called a motorcycle, a riding device he would use in his job as a courier. He admitted that it still took him some time to learn how to ride it, but suggested that the boy should get used to it for now. Kanso stared at the car in surprise and asked what it was. Then Sam threw him the helmet and explained what the thing was called. He then put on his own helmet and explained that motorcycles are fast and therefore dangerous, so riders need protective gear. The protagonist, listening attentively, grinned and put the helmet on his head. In his opinion, they were almost identical to the helmets that warriors wore. Sam then got on the motorcycle and told his companion to sit behind him. Kanso complied, climbing onto the back of the bike and remarking that it was a lot like riding a horse. Sam laughed and agreed. In a way it was. Having said this, Sam engaged the clutch, and looking sideways at the main character, noted that this was where the resemblance to a horse ended. According to him, the motorcycle was 100 times faster, so there was nothing to be afraid of. Before he could say this, the vehicle took off and quickly sped down the road. After a few minutes, Sam turned his head slightly and asked his passenger if he was feeling okay, or if he was experiencing motion sickness. Kanso remained silent, not knowing what to answer. After a moment's hesitation, he pressed himself closer to the man and asked if it was really necessary to travel in this manner. Sam, catching the worry in his voice, asked in response if Kanso was afraid. As they continued to speed down the street, he explained that the fear of riding a motorcycle would make delivery work nearly impossible, as there were no other fast ways to get around the city's narrow alleys. Kanso heard this and, thinking out loud, wondered if the real purpose of the job was to deliver food quickly. Then he found himself wondering if the speed was still too slow. The motorcycle was too loud in his opinion. He muttered to himself that using his body lightning technique he could go much faster than he was now. A few minutes later they stopped. Sam dismounted and suggested that they take a walk around the area, mentioning that most of the clients lived in this residential complex. He pointed to the sign and added that the place was called Lazurnoye. On the side of the building was a sector number, and the first digit of each apartment number indicated the floor it was on. Coughing awkwardly, the protagonist caught Sam's attention and remembered how he once told him that the city was too dangerous to live in due to the presence of monsters. He asked why in that case the people didn't just leave it. Sam then crossed his arms over his chest, replying that while the city was indeed dangerous, it was not to the point where people would voluntarily leave their homes. He explained that 25 years ago, monsters first appeared, making it initially impossible to live there. However, soon after this, people discovered that they could use magic stones to build protective barriers around cities. Thanks to these barriers, their city became relatively safe, and Kanso, interested, immediately asked what kind of stones these were. Sam, smiling, told him that they looked like nuggets found in the bodies of slain monsters. These stones, he explained, contained so much energy that they gradually began to replace traditional energy sources, leading to a significant leap forward in scientific development. However, he added that this did not mean the streets were completely safe, so caution was still needed. Then, deciding that they needed a break, Sam took a can of soda out of his bag and opened it with a quiet hiss, smiling as he handed it to the protagonist, asking if he wanted to try it. Kanso instinctively took a step back at the sound of the can opening and asked in fear what it was. Sam laughed and offered him a try, insisting that he would like it. After all, he was sure that the protagonist had never tried anything like it before. Kanso took the jar in his hand. Looking at it nervously, he thought to himself that he was afraid to try it, but on the other hand, he also hesitated before trying the jjajangmyeon dish. Gathering his courage, he took a sip, wondering what taste awaited him. Instantly, he felt an electric current run through his body, causing it to glow faintly. A spicy sweetness spread within him like a lightning bolt of sudden enlightenment after long, intense training. He frowned slightly and carefully crushed the can with one hand, thinking about how strange this drink was. Looking at the aluminum shell, he decided that even the Ice Palace Elder's magical panaceas couldn't compare to this. Sam, smiling again, asked if he was surprised. He patted his stomach and added that this drink also helps with indigestion. Kanso, amazed, exclaimed that it was incredible. Sam then walked up to the motorcycle and said that it was time to go back as they had had enough rest. Then Kanso wondered again if he really had no alternative. Sam, taken aback, admitted that while other modes of transport certainly existed, nothing was as suitable for a courier as a motorcycle. The protagonist replied that he could handle it just fine on foot, and Sam's jaw dropped in shock as he began waving his arms and shouting that the deliveries had to be quick. Otherwise the noodles will swell during transportation, spoiling both the appearance of the dish and the mood of the buyer. Kanso looked at him coldly and said that he had nothing to worry about. Pointing to himself, he confidently added that on foot he was faster than any motorcycle. Sam cried out in disbelief, asking how that was possible. Then, after a moment of thought, he crossed his arms over his chest and decided that it wasn't that unlikely. He reasoned that the boy had most likely awakened. Probably at least Class A. Kanso said that if Sam didn't believe him, he would demonstrate it on the way back. Then Sam nodded and climbed onto the motorcycle, asking if the protagonist remembered the way to the restaurant. When Kanso confirmed that he had done it, Sam said that he believed him, although they would check it just in case. He told Kanso to run, adjusted his helmet and added that he would meet him there. He started the engine and announced that if Kanso really managed to fight him off, he would approve the delivery without the motorcycle for him, with which he sped off, announcing that the race had begun. In fact, Kanso was not called the Emperor of Flame for nothing. He possessed extraordinary mastery over the element of fire, especially the skill known as the invisible body technique. As the name suggests, this made him completely invisible, allowing him to approach enemies undetected and eliminate them with ease. After reaching the level of enlightenment, he further refined the technique, turning it into the void invisible body technique. Moving with astonishing speed, he passed by the awakened company staff without being noticed. His form, enveloped in magical energy, left no traces. This technique didn't just mask his presence. It dramatically increased his agility and speed to seemingly impossible levels. This new evolution of his technique, combined with his status as the best martial artist, earned him the title of God of Martial Arts. It was a title even more revered than God of Death, A few minutes later, Sam pulled up to the restaurant on his motorcycle, stopped the car, dismounted, and took off his helmet. Taking a deep breath, he looked around and asked where the main character had gone. As he approached the restaurant door, he muttered under his breath that Kanso must have been going full speed ahead, treating this like a competition. When he opened the door, he was immediately shocked. Standing in front of him was his family, his wife, his daughter, and the main character. The man stared at Kanso incredulously, blurting out whether he had actually arrived before him. His wife Sarah, laughing slightly, informed him that the main character had appeared 10 minutes earlier. Still confused, the man approached the young man and, remembering his previous promise, allowed him to make the delivery without using transport. Then, as if struck by a sudden thought, he reminded Kanso of the upcoming test of superpowers. This news surprised Kanso, who did not expect it so soon. However, Sam, clearly excited, enthusiastically exclaimed that the test simply had to be taken, as he was curious to know the classification of the main character. Some time passed and the guys came to the testing site. A tall skyscraper loomed ahead. The man put his hands on his hips and loudly announced that they had finally arrived. But internally he admitted with some embarrassment that he had somehow convinced the boy to take the test. Looking around, Kanso noted how crowded the place was, and as an undocumented citizen, a person who had just come out of the portal, he was required to go through numerous bureaucratic procedures. The two of them sat down at one of the reception windows, where Kanso was handed a form to fill out. Looking at the form, Kanso asked what exactly he should write, considering that he had no identification. Sam pointed to one of the boxes and told him to use the restaurant's address in the area designated for his stay. When they finally exited the building, Sam clenched his fists, mentally expressing his fatigue from the endless paperwork. At that moment, the protagonist turned to him. Taken by surprise, Sam asked what was on his mind. Kanso asked how exactly the test would be carried out. Sam responded by explaining that during the test, he would have to place his hands on two spherical objects slightly larger than his fist. Then an electric current will flow between them. The stronger the impact, the lower the classification. Those who are better able to resist this will be considered to be awakened individuals of a higher level, as the strength of their resistance indicates a higher energetic potential. Kanso then asked if it was really beneficial to be high class. Sam assured him that it was. Life could change dramatically for a person with high class. In fact, he added, some particularly gifted people were considered national treasures. He noticed that high class brings with it comfort and ease. Kanso thought to himself that anyone else in his place would have jumped for joy at the thought of wealth and recognition. But he believed that fame and fortune were ultimately fleeting. In his opinion, human desires were endless and insatiable. No matter how hard a person tried, one life would never be enough to satisfy them all. He remembered the time when he had left the world of temptations to seek peace in a secluded mountain village. He reminded himself that he could not allow his inner peace to be disturbed again. Raising his head to look at the towering skyscraper, Kanso made a silent decision that from now on, he would hide his true level. He then informed Sam that he was ready to continue, and the man nodded approvingly and wished him luck. Shortly after, the elevator with the hero inside arrived at the second floor. Kanso noticed the automated voice announcing the floor number, and watched with slight amazement as the doors opened. He mentally noted that the box not only moved on its own, but also spoke. And when he walked out, a man approached him and asked if he was Kanso. Nodding in confirmation, Kanso heard the man introduce himself as Peter, the head of Section 2, and inform him that he would be conducting the test. They shook hands, and Kanso politely remarked that it was nice to meet him. Peter smiled and replied that the feeling was mutual. Then, with a hint of nostalgia, he added that it had been quite a while since they had tested the isolationist. An interested Kanso asked if that was true. Peter explained that there had been a surge of isolationists about 10 years ago, but over time the Korean government had managed to regain control over most of the territory, and such incidents had become rare. He even joked that the North had little chance before, and even less so now. Kanso stared at him in confusion, wondering which North this man was referring to. As they approached the room, Peter told him that the test would take place there based on Kanso's classification, and he would be sent for appropriate training later. He grinned and handed a piece of paper to his assistant, informing her that he had brought a test subject. Kanso's attention was immediately drawn to two glowing spheres, exactly as Sam had described. The girl told him to place both hands on the spheres and remain still until the test was completed. The protagonist carefully spread his hands, then the assistant activated the device, and Kanso realized that he did not feel any electric current at all. His body seemed to be completely resisting the attack. He remembered Sam's words that the greater the resistance, the higher the classification. He looked down at the spheres and decided that he needed to harness his inner energy. A shining stream of magical energy flowed between the spheres. After a few tense moments, the assistant began pressing buttons, turning off the device. She informed him that the test was complete and that he could remove his hands. The result, she announced, was a Class F. Kanso, worried, asked what this meant. She explained that Class F humans were technically awakened, but only slightly more capable than normal humans, who were scientifically classified as Class G. Peter watched the protagonist with sympathy. He assumed that, being an isolationist, Kanso had hoped for a higher classification, and imagined how disappointed he must be. Meanwhile, Kanso sighed mentally. He realized that he had made a mistake. He had only lowered his resistance enough to get an F class, while he had intended to get a G class. He scolded himself for simply not being able to lower his resistance all the way. Peter, now with tears in her eyes, suddenly burst into a heartfelt plea, begging Kanso not to let his classification determine his worth as a person. He insisted that his value went far beyond a simple label. The protagonist, however, stared back at him in confusion, unable to fully understand why the department head was so agitated. Meanwhile, the story moves to the Korean Awakened Association's support department, the department in question that handled matters of great importance and strict confidentiality. His task forces were organized by numerical rank, with the first group handling the most highly classified cases and the rest following in descending order of secrecy, the head of the second group being responsible for training the isolationists, a position of no small importance. This was because among the isolationists, there were often awakened individuals with the potential of the upper class, even if this duty interfered with the performance of their main duties. The organization of proper training for such people remained mandatory. At that moment, Buck stood next to Peter's desk, casually asking if the man was working overtime again. Peter, clearly startled, looked at his colleague and asked what could have brought such a busy man as the leader of the first group to his office at such an hour. Buck simply patted Peter on the shoulder and explained that he had heard about the signing of the order regarding the training of isolationists. This news prompted him to register, and incidentally, to invite Peter to share dinner with him. He looked warmly at Peter and asked how the testing had gone. Peter, rubbing his forehead, replied that Buck could see the results for himself. He was the first isolationist to appear in many years. Although the higher-ups remained silent on the matter, their displeasure was obvious. He then opened the file on the monitor, which showed the protagonist's rank, F. Buck, surprised, confirmed that it was indeed an F rank. Peter just nodded, noting that such outcomes did happen from time to time. Buck expressed regret as he looked at the screen, while Peter added that a long period of isolation as an isolationist could lead to difficulties, and it would be much better for him to be included in the upper class. Peter then raised his head and said with a grin that he wouldn't mind some kimbap or anything else to satisfy his hunger. Buck, reacting with feigned disappointment, squeezed Peter's shoulder tightly, and the man, alarmed, asked what was wrong. Then Buck smiled widely and teased him for sneaking into his office in the middle of the night to offer him cold gimbap from a convenience store, insisting that only fresh ones would do. Peter protested in horror, saying they could have gotten by with simpler food. But Buck, now really animated, shouted that fine food was not to be underestimated. Meanwhile, the main character woke up from his sleep and sat up abruptly in bed. The clock showed almost 6 a.m. He looked at him and noted to himself that his friends in the spring pavilion were most likely already awake. As he put on his slippers, he stretched out his arms and thought that his sleep had been unsatisfactory, perhaps due to the intense mental effort of the previous day. However, he remembered that the previous day had brought not only tension, but also pleasant moments. After his afternoon workout and dinner, he sat down at the table with a delicious bun in front of him. Awakening from this brief memory, Kanso thoughtfully touched his chin and admitted to himself that, other than jjajangmyeon, this roll was one of the few dishes in this life that had truly surprised him. He scratched the back of his head, realizing he had to do something about the lingering fatigue. He thought that the chi breathing practice might help. However, Kanso quickly realized that this couldn't be done here. Too many people in the building would notice that he wasn't a Class F at all. He remembered Molly, the woman who had almost caught the disease while eating, and he concluded that even if she had felt something, the association's headquarters, filled with awakened people of all classes, would have posed an even greater risk. Some of them probably had a more acute sense of aura than Molly, so he had to remain careful. Thinking about all this, he sat back down on his bed and reflected on how surprised he had been at the department's persistence in training him. He initially assumed it would be superficial, but the training turned out to be much more meaningful than expected. He remembered what happened last night in the classroom. Peter was standing in front of the students with a book in his hands. A portal was shown on the projector behind it. He explained that an S-class portal had suddenly opened, releasing hordes of monsters. The result was devastating, with both civilians and awakened suffering massive losses. This event became known as the Great Clash. Although humanity eventually triumphed over the monsters, the conflict zone became uninhabitable, and was now called the Land of Death. Even criminals did not dare to hide there. The main character listened attentively. He remembered the moment when he came out of the portal. It really was in the Land of Death. Only after that he found the city. He rested his chin on his hand, and thought that even if 2 or 3 S-class portals opened at the same time, the association would not be able to contain the resulting chaos. It would be a disaster. Just the day before, Kanso had begun to understand the structure of society in this country, which now seemed to him like a tower of ill-fitting parts. He suspected that even the slightest jolt could cause the entire structure to collapse. As a martial artist of extremely high caliber, he found it ironic to appear in such a fragile society. Looking around, he came to the conclusion that a quiet and anonymous life was almost impossible for a man like him. Yet even if it was selfish, he deeply desired to spend the rest of his life in peace, so it was imperative that no one learn of his true rank. Kanso looked forward and suddenly frowned. Through the wall he felt a person approaching, a figure radiating pure energy. It was Peter. The man approached the door and knocked carefully, asking if Kanso was awake, and from inside the protagonist called him to come in. Peter walked inside, looking clearly exhausted. The protagonist, still sitting on the bed, looked at him and noticed his tiredness. Peter scratched his neck awkwardly and asked if it was true. Meanwhile, Kanso poured hot water from the coffee maker into a mug, added a packet of instant coffee, and gestured towards the coffee maker, inviting Peter to pour some for herself. Peter, pleasantly surprised, noticed that the main character had only learned this yesterday and was already practicing the next morning. Then Kanso, holding a steaming mug of coffee, turned with a smile and handed it to the man, modestly attributing his skill to Peter's leadership. Peter thanked him and took a sip, his body instantly seeming to fill with energy. He noted that the coffee tasted as if he had just awakened from the most refreshing sleep. The protagonist also took a sip of his drink, silently acknowledging that Peter had made a genuine effort in teaching him. Offering this coffee was his way of showing gratitude. Kanso immediately asked his boss what they were going to learn that day. Peter, raising his index finger, explained that their first lesson would be about the cafeteria. Kanso, intrigued, thought the cafeteria topic sounded interesting. Then Peter turned to him, laughing slightly, and mentioned that he had asked for a special menu to be prepared. Arriving at the cafeteria, the man noticed that it was quite crowded for the morning. Kanso, watching what was happening, thoughtfully compared the establishment to a field kitchen in a military campaign. Peter agreed, saying that the work was often like war, so the comparison was not far off. But he added that unlike in the field, the portions here were much larger. He told the protagonist to fill his tray with as much food as he wanted. Kanso, worried, asked what would happen if the people were late for breakfast and did not have enough food. Then Peter, smiling, admitted that the protagonist was quite considerate of others, but assured him that there was nothing to worry about. If some dishes ran out, the cafeteria staff simply prepared new ones. Kanso then picked up the ladle, expressing his amazement at the idea. Peter continued by saying that they were living in an age of plenty, and after the wars such conveniences had become possible. While the protagonist agreed that living in an age of abundance was a blessing, he admitted that what surprised him most was something else. He was amazed by the speed of logistics and the incredible technologies that made it possible to preserve food products for a long time. Peter, thinking that the protagonist was an isolationist and had only started his training the day before, was impressed by his strategic thinking and laughed, attributing it all to the local scientists whose work made a wide range of products available all year round. For office workers like himself, Peter said, the cafeteria was a place to relax and recharge, and Kanso agreed, adding that eating was probably the most enjoyable part of the day. Then Peter, taking a deep breath, admitted that he rarely visited the cafeteria, since he usually had to settle for quick food. Soon after, they found themselves in an elevator, and the man asked the protagonist if he liked the food. Kanso nodded enthusiastically, expressing that he liked it very much. A pleased Peter replied that it had been a great experience, since he had already shown the protagonist the cafeteria, and he thought that was enough for today. Kanso, however, was a little disappointed and mentioned that he thought there would be more lessons. He asked if it was possible to continue. In response, Peter sighed, noting that the protagonist was not easily fooled. He explained that the next class would be a tour of the gym, but added with a smile that for a first grader like him, it was not necessary, so they could skip it. Peter commented that being an F class isn't so bad after all, as it has less responsibility. Turning away from the protagonist, he clenched his fist, thinking to himself that he was interrupting the lesson because he was distracted by his own work. He felt that he was deceiving a naive isolationist who did not yet understand the realities of his world. As soon as the elevator doors opened, the man pointed forward and indicated that there was a gym ahead. He mentioned that any awakened person has the right to train there, regardless of their class. He explained that all awakened ones are allowed to use the gym, except for criminal imposters, who will be denied entry. The man looked at the newcomer and added that if he wanted to train there, that would be great. Kanso, however, firmly replied that he could do without it. Peter looked at him in surprise and confusion, wondering why the protagonist did not take advantage of this opportunity. He explained that all the services were free and he could explain how the gym could benefit him. Kanso, however, looked around at the diligent people in the room and said that he appreciated their efforts, but did not believe that he would need any training. The man, surprised and a little puzzled, asked what the protagonist's plans were for the future. After a while he came out of the building and saw Sam nearby. He came up and thanked him for coming to meet him. Sam, in turn, politely replied that it was not a problem. Then he asked what class he was in, to which the protagonist handed him his hunting license and said that he was in Class F. Hearing this, Sarah raised her hand to her face with slight disappointment, noticing that he looked like a person who should be in the G class, like a normal person. Kanso then explained that he had failed to harness his internal energy in time, which resulted in a higher grade than he had expected. Sam, approaching him with a more attentive expression, remarked that it was not a bad thing at all. His abilities were clearly beyond the ordinary, and it was impossible for an ordinary person to possess them without attracting attention. Kanso asked if he was really that suspicious, to which Sam confirmed that the people from the company had been watching him closely the whole time. By the time Peter finished telling the story, Jean, who was standing next to him, asked if there was anything else unusual about this guy. Peter shrugged and replied that the protagonist had incredible intelligence and the ability to learn. He remembered how the protagonist offered him coffee and said that, to be more precise, the protagonist was very smart. If you explained a concept to him, he immediately understood how to apply it in different contexts. He learned quickly and remembered information well. Jean, with a thoughtful expression on his face, rested his chin on his hand and said that the law enforcement department, especially the first group, shared something much more interesting with him. They mentioned that the protagonist's movements and sense of balance were not typical for anyone in his class, and they even had doubts about whether the testing machine was functioning properly. Peter, confused, explained that after testing the machine had been checked again and there were no problems with it, he was confident that the protagonist's class had been fairly distributed. However, Peter said that while anyone could develop further, the protagonist would never go beyond the lower classes, let alone reach the upper levels. Then Peter asked if the protagonist's unusual attention was due to the fact that so many years had passed since an isolationist appeared in the company. Then Jin, still thinking, admitted that he expected more from the protagonist, so he was a little disappointed. Then he asked about his plans for the future. Peter, thinking about his student, remembered that the main character mentioned wanting to help his friend in the restaurant business. Meanwhile, at the Spring Pavilion, Sam handed him a phone, saying that he could contact him any time with this thing. Kanso expressed his gratitude to his friend. Sam then reminded him that he had bought the device with his isolationist allowance. Then he asked if he needed anything else. His wife Sarah, who was sitting next to him on the couch, also asked if the protagonist had any wishes. Kanso, looking at his hair, mentioned that he had been thinking about cutting it. He added that he had never really noticed it before, but had recently noticed that most men in their civilization wore their hair short, so he didn't want to stand out. Hearing this, Sarah clapped her hands happily. Expressing approval of the idea, she eagerly asked what kind of haircut he wanted, assuring him that short hair would suit him very well. Her husband scratched his cheek, a little embarrassed, and agreed, admitting that any hairstyle would suit their friend, but he suddenly remembered that he needed to chop ingredients for tomorrow's dinner. Sam, heading to the kitchen, reflected that when his wife started talking about fashion, it could go on forever. Then Sarah, with a radiant smile and sparkling eyes, turned to the protagonist and invited him to accompany her to the hairdresser. Sometime later, as they approached the barber shop, Sam commented that the main character's new haircut was so stylish that it could be seen from a mile away. As they walked down the street, the protagonist began to experience a strange feeling, as if everyone was staring at him. People on the street remarked that he had the appearance of a model and admired his looks. An unknown girl even ran up to him, asking for an autograph and a joint photo. and soon after that, another girl made the same request. Then Sam, worried, came forward. Apologizing to the girls, he told them that the main character was not a celebrity, but an ordinary guy, and there was no need to ask him for autographs. The girls were surprised and couldn't believe it. One of them noted that such a handsome guy couldn't be an ordinary person. Sam exhaled heavily and, approaching the main character, muttered that the girls were just crazy. Kanso, confused, wondered why he couldn't just take a photo with the girls. Sam explained that the main character was so handsome that he was often mistaken for a celebrity. He warned that if the girls were allowed to take pictures with him, these pictures would most likely be posted on the internet, and soon the main character would be recognized everywhere. Sam warned that such attention would only bring trouble. Kanso, looking at him with slight fear, nodded in agreement. He thought to himself that he needed to be more careful. It would not be good for him to stand out in the crowd in such an obvious way. The next day the cafe was full of people. Everyone was chatting and enjoying their food. The waiter wished the girls bon appetit, which immediately lifted their spirits, and they thanked him. Kanso was walking through the cafe holding a menu in his hands when he suddenly noticed a table with people. He approached the table and asked if the girl had decided what she wanted to order. The girl immediately covered her face with her hands and shouted for him to bring her 2 servings of jjajangmyeon and seafood udon. Then the hero smiled and asked her to wait a little, then passed the order to the cook, who took it. The other 2 tables immediately ordered the same dishes. The people in the cafe were animated and enjoying their food, and the girl, after trying the food, exclaimed that the cuisine in this cafe was excellent. She and her friends agreed to come back every day for more rating men. Meanwhile, Sarah, smiling, thanked the girl and told her to come again. Just at that moment, another girl from the side called out to her, asking if there were any free seats. Sarah smiled awkwardly and explained that the cafe was fully booked. The girl, upset by this news, immediately clenched her fist and shouted that she would wait. At that moment, another girl in the queue also shouted that she would also wait. Then Sarah, with a sweaty face, said that they were almost out of food in the kitchen, so it would be better if the girls came back tomorrow. With tears in their eyes, the girls expressed their disappointment, complaining that they were not able to eat at the establishment that day. Suddenly, a woman's cry was heard from the crowd asking to be let through. Sarah looked down the aisle and saw a girl raising her hand. The girl greeted her and introduced herself as Jenny, saying that she had come for an interview. Jenny extended her hand and introduced herself properly, explaining that she was 23 years old, a college graduate, and currently looking for a job in her field. Sarah took her to the restaurant and explained that the establishment had been short of workers lately, which is why they decided to hire another part-time worker. The girl was impressed and noted that the Spring Pavilion was a very famous restaurant, and she was happy to work there. Sarah, somewhat embarrassed by the flattery, asked if the restaurant was really that famous. Then, looking at the main character, Jenny added that this handsome guy had attracted the attention of the entire female population. Kanso, watching his future colleague, was quite surprised. Their eyes met, and he thought to himself that she was an interesting person. Her strong aura impressed him. He realized that in this civilization, people with superpowers lived well and were valued, which led to a much higher quality of life than ordinary people. Jenny, feeling a little confused, followed Sarah into the kitchen. Sarah then asked her to help pack the pickled radishes for now, as she still had to take care of the delivery and orders. Sarah then approached the protagonist and handed him a list of orders. She asked him to deliver everything according to the instructions. Soon, Kanso had prepared all the dishes for delivery, put on his helmet and said that he was ready to deliver the orders. Jenny, turning around with a smile, assured him that everything was fine. At this point, Sam, having finished preparing the dish, placed it on the table, and asked the new employee to help pack the portions. During the break, Jenny looked at the visitors and noticed that when she first heard about the Spring Pavilion, she was told that there were few visitors there. Just at that moment, the main character appeared behind her and asked if she was busy. Jenny, surprised, turned around and asked if he had delivered everything yet. Kanso confirmed that this was the case, explaining that the delivery addresses were just a few steps away. Jenny then placed another box of orders on the table and announced that everything was packed and ready to ship. Kanso took the package and told Jenny that he was leaving. The girl waved her hand at him, reminding him to be careful. After some time, once inside the restaurant, the protagonist mentioned that he had finished with the delivery. Sam looked at him and asked him to sit down, noting that he had already delivered everything for lunch. Kanso came up to the table and asked if they were already getting ready for the evening picnic. Sarah confirmed that they were, but she suddenly remembered that it was time to pick up Hannah from kindergarten. Hearing this, Jenny approached the owner and asked if they really had a daughter. Sarah looked at her and answered in the affirmative, explaining that their daughter was 5 years old. She then turned to the protagonist, asking if he could pick up Hannah from kindergarten, as they were expecting an influx of visitors that evening and had barely had time to prepare food. Kanso responded without hesitation, offering to help and assuring them that he would be back soon. Then Jenny, looking confused, turned to the woman. She shyly said that she also wanted to meet Hannah. She asked if she could go with the main character. Sarah's husband winked at the woman and she immediately understood. Then she agreed that they could go together. Her excitement was obvious. Jenny was overjoyed and said that they would be back soon. He and Kanso walked along the road together, each holding an umbrella. As they walked, the girl introduced herself, adding that she was 23 years old. Then she asked the protagonist what she should call him. Kanso said that he was 35 years old, but she could call him whatever she wanted, at which point Jenny, taken aback, exclaimed that he certainly didn't look 35 at all. Then Kanso turned his gaze to her and explained that for some reason many people thought that way. Intrigued, he decided to ask her why she decided to take a job at the Spring Pavilion, given her abilities. In response, Jenny turned away, feeling a little awkward, and denied that she had any abilities at all. She smiled, convincing the protagonist not to think that she had any evil intentions. She just wanted to look at him. But before Jenny could finish, she suddenly screamed, pointing towards the doors where someone was standing. She asked if it was Hannah, the girl they were following. The teacher told the girl to say hello to her uncle, and with that, Hannah began waving happily, smiling widely. Kanso asked if she had a good time, to which the girl nodded enthusiastically. Then she looked proudly at the teacher and announced that he was her uncle. The girl greeted the main character, saying that Hannah had told her a lot about him, and she was very curious to meet her wonderful uncle. Kanso then asked if she was okay, to which the girl blushed and screamed loudly, immediately asking for forgiveness. She turned to Jenny and asked if she was the protagonist's wife. Then suddenly the teacher recognized Jenny and asked if it was really her. However, Jenny quickly covered her mouth with her hand and interrupted, shouting that she actually worked there. Sora then whispered to her about her work in the guild, but Jenny insisted that she not mention it. She looked at Hannah and explained that her parents thought she was a normal person. She added that she was on a mission and asked Sora to pretend she didn't know her. She then waved goodbye to Hannah, saying she would see her tomorrow. After this, the main character turned to the teacher, telling her that it was time for them to leave. After saying goodbye, they began to descend the stairs. As they walked, the protagonist turned to Jenny and asked if the kindergarten teacher was her friend. In response, Jenny laughed awkwardly, confirming that this was true. However, Kanso wondered why they hardly talked in that case. Jenny blushed, and explained that they saw each other too often, which made her laugh out loud. Then she looked at the girl and said that walking in the rain with an umbrella was nice. Hannah happily agreed with her, asking if her pretty aunt also liked to walk in the rain. Jenny smiled and replied that she preferred walking with her uncle. Then Hannah said that she liked her umbrella because it had ducks painted on it. At this moment, Kanso looked at Hannah and asked if it was too heavy for her to carry the umbrella. In response, Hannah smiled and assured him that it was not too heavy, so she could carry it herself. She walked forward happily, and the protagonist said that if she needed help, she should ask for it. They continued walking down the street, passing an alley where a wet animal was sitting. Suddenly the girl stopped, peering into the alley. She pointed and exclaimed that there was someone there. Hannah then immediately ran forward, shouting for her uncle to look at what was there. She noticed a mouse lying on the ground and screamed that it was squeaking. Then Kanso picked her up and asked why she was out in the rain. Then Jenny leaned over to take a closer look and said it wasn't just a mouse. She said it was a dungeon rat. Then Kanso asked if it was some kind of magical animal. Jenny explained that the underground rat lived in the dungeons, but was not a magical creature. Unlike magical beasts, she did not harbor hostility towards people, and did not try to harm them. This rat had a heightened sense of her natural enemies, magical beasts and monsters. Jenny noticed that the rat's skills and cute appearance made it a favorite among hunters, many of whom tamed it. She assumed that the rat had entered the portal with its owner, and something had gone wrong, and, injured, it had somehow gotten out of the portal. Hannah looked sadly at the injured rat, and then screamed that she didn't want it to die. She asked if they could heal it. Then Kanso looked at the girl and replied that it would not be easy to save her. Hannah tearfully asked if it was true that the rat was still alive, adding that if it was still breathing, they shouldn't abandon it. These words deeply affected the protagonist. He remembered himself kneeling among the dead bodies, and thought to himself that he was blind. He realized that even if the rat was still breathing, it would die sooner or later. After much internal debate, he decided that all life was valuable. He remembered his past and wondered how he could be any different from the cold-blooded killer he once was. After a short pause, the The protagonist closed his eyes and, despite his uncertainty about this decision, said that he would take the rat with him. Jenny looked at the girl, her face softening into a smile, and said that they would rush to the restaurant and try to save the animal. Kanzo noticed that the rat was in very bad condition, barely breathing. He warned that they needed to hurry if they wanted to save her. Hearing this, Hana became very scared and asked what they should do. Kanzo looked at the trembling rat and noted to himself that its breathing and heartbeat were weak, as if it were dying. After a short pause, he pressed 2 fingers to the animal and poured magical energy through them, wondering if he should breathe life into it. Jenny watched the process, her face reflecting obvious surprise, beads of cold sweat running down her face. After a while the others returned, and the girl immediately rushed to her parents. Her mother looked at her with concern and asked what was wrong and why she was crying. Hana screamed, begging for help. Then Kanzo extended his hand, holding the wounded rat, and the girl's parents were clearly shocked. Sam stepped forward and recognized the creature as a dungeon rat. He asked where they found it, and the protagonist explained that it was found in an alley. Sam then pointed to the rat and noted that it looked like it had been attacked in the portal not far from there, and that it was barely breathing. Hana then spread her arms wide and loudly declared that she would rescue the rat and take it for herself. After which Sarah sat down next to her daughter and, smiling warmly, explained that it was not a hamster, but a dungeon rat. If they found it outside the dungeon, then it most likely had an owner who was probably looking for it and was concerned about its well-being. Kanzo, looking at the rat, agreed with Sarah, but added that first they needed to cure it. And then Sam, having come to his senses, admitted that the priority should be caring for the rat. He suggested that they find the nearest veterinary clinic. Just then, the door to the restaurant opened and Buck and Morty walked in, greeting everyone. Sam looked at the new arrivals and invited them to sit down, asking if they had come to eat. However, Buck immediately noticed the underground rat and came over to examine it, asking if it belonged to them. Sam calmly confirmed that it was indeed the same rat, and explained that his daughter had found it on the street, and it appeared to be injured. Then, the man thoughtfully put his hand to his chin, and noticed that the rat's condition was indeed serious. Then Morty came over and asked if he could take a look. He carefully picked up the rat and assured them that they could help her. After examining the rat, he was amazed at how well it had already been treated, stating that the first aid had been very professional, and the rat was in much better condition than it had appeared at first glance. Buck, listening, noted that the rat had been brought out of critical condition, and would only need a small amount of additional energy to fully recover. Meanwhile, Kanzo, observing Buck, immediately realized that this man was gifted, but he never imagined that he possessed such mystical abilities. As he watched as Buck enveloped the rat in mana, and seemed to draw energy from the environment, converting it into healing power, Kanzo concluded that Buck was likely a healer. The rat suddenly started squeaking, and Hana's face lit up with happiness when she saw it. Then Buck, smiling, put his hand on Morty's shoulder and introduced him as their famous healer. Hana, jumping for joy, shouted that the uncle was simply a miracle worker. He handed the rat to Hana, who thanked him and expressed her appreciation. Buck smirked and remarked that this little girl was very lucky, and Morty agreed. Kanzo, looking at them, thought to himself that this must be the true power of the awakened, and it was truly incredible. Sam then approached the girl and asked what she was doing. Hana explained that she was looking after a rat, and it seemed to be getting better. A few seconds later she squealed, screaming that the rat had moved. Her father asked if this was really the case, and Hana added impatiently that she had put out a bowl of milk for the rat, suggesting that it was probably hungry. Sam smiled warmly and told his daughter that the rat had eaten, which meant it was time for her to eat too, and he advised her to wash her hands before eating. After the rat drank the milk, it looked forward, and Hana, still watching it, began tapping its head on the table in confusion. Kanzo, puzzled, asked what was wrong with her, wondering if the rat was trying to tell him something. The rat began jumping around the room and squeaking loudly, apparently trying to attract the protagonist's attention, urging him to follow it. At this point, Sam entered the room, and noticing the rat's strange behavior, asked what was wrong with it. Kanzo replied that the rat seemed to be leading him somewhere. He wondered if she was really trying to show him something. And then the rat squeaked loudly in response, as if confirming her intention. Sam, thoughtfully resting his chin on his hand, said that the animal was quite intelligent, but he thought it odd that it had no owner, and he supposed that something must have happened. Turning to the protagonist, Sam asked if he should go and see. Kanzo agreed, noting that he walks quickly and can quickly check everything. He put his hand to his chin, considering the situation, but ultimately decided to follow the rat. In response, Sam waved his hand, suggesting that they couldn't just ignore the rat, as Hannah would be upset. The girl clenched her fists, looking at the main character with an encouraging smile. Kanso, smiling in response, agreed to go, although he felt a sense of caution. He turned to the rat, noting that he could sense a strange energy surrounding it. Meanwhile, Sam, watching the rat, admitted that he did not fully understand the situation. But the protagonist said that he had seen such energy before, although he still could not explain it. He asked the rat if it knew where it wanted to go, and it responded with a squeak. Taking her in his arms, the protagonist decided to go with her. Then Sam and Hannah wished him good luck. As they stepped outside, the animal began to shiver from the cold, squeaking loudly, at which point Kanso noticed a stream of aura ahead and asked if they were heading in that direction. Running closer, he looked up and saw that it resembled the portal through which he entered this world. The portal brightly illuminated the street, and the protagonist realized that it was definitely a portal. Meanwhile, from inside the portal, screams and wheezing of an approaching horde of monsters could be heard. The awakened who came to clear the dungeon were clearly stunned. One of them waved his hand and shouted, asking if they were really going to die here. His comrade, fighting back with his shield, shouted that there were too many monsters. Another man, counting, announced that there were only 4 monsters left. Meanwhile, the girl with the raised staff began to tremble, warning that she would soon run out of strength and would no longer be able to maintain the barrier. The man heard her words and looked at the number of monsters surrounding them, realizing that this could be the end. He expressed gratitude for having the opportunity to fight alongside them. His comrade smiled and thanked him for everything, then suggested throwing a party in the afterlife. The scarred man mockingly replied that he had had enough of them in this life. The girl, holding the staff with the little strength she had left, thought to herself that only an S-rank hunter could save them, but that thought seemed like nothing more than a distant, pipe dream. As soon as this thought came to her mind, the glow of her staff began to fade. Suddenly a squeak of an underground rat was heard from behind. The others were caught off guard, their attention switched to the source of the sound. In the blink of an eye, the green blood of the monsters sprayed out in all directions, and the skeletons around them were blown to pieces. The mage girl, tears streaming down her face, called out weakly. Her companion screamed in shock and asked if all the monsters had been killed. When all had calmed down, the ground was littered with the remains of many skeletons. The awakened began to look around, confused by what had just happened, wondering what had happened. They were surrounded, and yet now everything seemed to have changed in an instant. It was then that the girl turned to them and asked if they had heard Karanga's squeal. At that moment, the protagonist rushed forward, determined to destroy the monsters with his incredible technique. He poured magical power into his hand, which began to glow brightly, and with one blow, he destroyed all the monsters in his path. The area around him was covered in pools of green blood, and there were many lifeless bodies lying around him. As the carnage died down, Kanso remembered that the last time they encountered monsters in the portal, they failed to destroy them all, leaving the smaller ones alive. This kept the portal open, but this time he was determined to see it through to the end. While he was thinking about this, a monster appeared behind him. Kanso immediately sensed its presence, and quickly turned around, cutting the monster in two. When he cut off part of the zombie's head, he noticed something was shining inside it. That's when he realized that it was their core, meaning the head was the weak point. At that moment, a horde of monsters began to crawl towards him. Suddenly, the protagonist noticed a sword lying nearby. He rushed towards it with incredible speed, muttering under his breath that he would lend it to him. He gripped the weapon tightly and declared that he would avenge its previous owner. Then the zombies and skeletons rushed forward to attack. But the air was filled with the sound of rapid successive blows, followed by the lifeless bodies of the monsters collapsing to the ground. Within minutes, the battlefield was littered with dead bodies, their twisted bodies strewn across the floor. Kanso stood in front of the huge doors that were oozing demonic energy. He carefully approached, and with some effort, he placed his hands on the doors and swung them open. As the doors creaked open, a voice came from inside asking who dared to disturb his peace. And before the hero stood a massive headless horseman, clearly furious. The rider roared, demanding to know how the protagonist had the audacity to invade his domain. Stamping his foot, the rider proclaimed that no one would escape unharmed. He raised his weapon, swearing that creatures like the protagonist were only fit to be killed. When the rider swung his weapon, the protagonist managed to dodge, surprised to see that the knight was holding his own head in his hand. The rider, taken aback by the protagonist's words, was even more stunned when the protagonist added that he had a rather unique appearance. The rider's eyes flashed with rage, and he shouted that Kanso would pay for mocking him. With a mighty blow, the rider aimed his spear towards Kanso, rushing down to strike, intending to kill him with one blow. Then Kanso, enveloped in mana, raised his hand and asked if the rider's weak point was his head. The rider frowned and looked at the protagonist in confusion. Kanso raised his head, looking intently at the rider, and began waving his arms. Leaving a magical trail in the air, the rider, screaming in rage, called him an insolent man. Without thinking twice, the main character launched a magical beam at the knight, piercing him right through. The rider then let out a loud cry before vanishing into thin air, leaving behind only a swirl of purple mana. A glowing stone fell from the dissipating figure, landing at the protagonist's feet. He picked it up, wondering what it was. After examining it, Kanso guessed that it was probably the source of the energy he had sensed earlier, probably what the people in this world called magic stones. As the stone began to glow brightly, emitting blue mana, the rat in the protagonist's pocket peeked out, quietly squeaking. She climbed onto his shoulder, and the protagonist, feeling a sense of accomplishment, muttered that he had eliminated everything that posed a threat. The rat then jumped onto Kanso's hand, and the protagonist told her that the portal would soon close. So he gently lowered her to the ground, urging the animal to run to its owner. He put the rat down on the ground, wishing it well, and watched as it squeaked loudly and ran towards the exit. Kanso then crossed his arms over his chest and muttered under his breath that Hana would definitely be upset. Soon the rat ran to the place where the group of awakened were. Several men in suits noted that for some unknown reason it was classified as a C-class dungeon. One of them suggested that perhaps an S-class hunter had come to their aid. However, another quickly pointed out that all the S-class hunters they had encountered emitted incredible power, and if any of them were in the dungeon, they would have felt it immediately. The man suggested that it could be the rumored awakened Class 0, to which the girl, lost in her thoughts, replied that anything was possible. Then she turned to the side, her gaze landing on the rat, and muttered that Korongi was definitely approaching. The rat, who was now looking around in fear, squeaked loudly, darting around in circles, the others wondering if she was really looking for someone in the dungeon. The girl's eyes filled with tears as she whispered that the rat was looking for one of their team, Soul. The boy turned to the bloody corpse nearby and quietly declared that he was already dead. Then Koronga ran up to the body, uttering a distressed squeal. She stood on her hind legs and stretched out her front legs towards the lifeless body, squealing in despair. Then Koronga turned back to the group, clutching her paws to her chest in fear. The girl looked forward, her voice shaking as she asked what was going on. The man replied that the portal was empty, and that it would close soon. They needed to collect as many magic stones as possible and meet at the exit in exactly 20 minutes. Meanwhile, the people standing behind the portal shouted that a special forces group was leaving and urged them to hurry with the stretcher. Koronga, still upset, ran past the people in despair. Meanwhile, people were shouting, asking how many were killed in total. It started to rain heavily outside, and the rat sat in the rain, quietly squeaking, with its head down sadly. Meanwhile, Hana sat in her room, feeling deep sadness. Her father came up to her and gently informed her that the rat had returned to its owner. He said that it was for the best. Then Hana, with tears in her eyes, replied that she knew it. Her voice broke as she said sadly that she would never see it again. And that was why she was sad. At that moment, the door to the house opened, and the protagonist walked inside. He immediately noticed the dejected expression on Hana's face and asked why she was so sad, as if someone had died. Sam looked at his friend and replied that she never said goodbye to the rat. Confused, Kanso asked which rat he meant. At that moment, Korongi climbed out of her pocket. Hana immediately heard a rat squeak and turned around. Without thinking, the girl rushed to hug the rat, while the protagonist turned to Sam and explained that the dungeon rat's name was Korongi. He raised his finger and continued saying that it seemed like the rat's owner had taken the rat along on a monster-slaying mission, and they had both gotten hurt. Hearing this, the man asked what exactly had happened. Kanso then said that he found the owner of the rat dead. He added that unfortunately nothing could be done as so much time had passed since the man's death. Sam's eyes suddenly widened in shock as he realized the gravity of the situation, and he asked incredulously if the protagonist had actually entered the dungeon. Kanso crossed his arms over his chest and confirmed that he had indeed entered there. Sam then pointed his thumb up, stating that the portal would probably be cleared soon. Kanso replied that the store had already been cleared and had since been closed. The man gasped in amazement. He then remembered how he worked as a loader in the past, and began to wonder about the protagonist's true class. Perhaps he was an S-class like the legendary Hunter Leon. He remembered the shock he felt when he first encountered an awakened one, and had the opportunity to interact with various hunters while working as a loader. Except for the unrivaled Hunter Leon, no one was able to enter the portal and clear it alone. However, Kanso did not emit such a terrifying aura as Leon, Leon emitted an almost insane magical energy that was almost impossible to ignore. If the protagonist hid his aura so well, it seemed likely that he was the supposed Class 0 awakened that everyone was talking about. His thoughts were interrupted by his daughter, who, having tied a bow on Korongi, asked everyone to look. Her father smiled tenderly and replied that she was just like a princess. He then turned his attention to the protagonist, smirking inwardly and thinking that there was nothing to worry about. After all, the protagonist was his friend, so it didn't matter whether he was a Class 0 awakened or not. Soon it was deep night, and Sam, lost in his thoughts, reassured himself that nothing bad would come of it. He decided to think only about the good. The next morning, Hannah, Sam, and Kanso decided to leave the dungeon rat, for which they received a scolding from Sarah. When the main character woke up, he looked at the calendar and realized that today was his day off. He wondered what he should do during the day. Should he train or perhaps look for a job for a couple of hours? Suddenly, a memory from his home world popped into his head. He remembered how that girl once scolded him for always working and never finding time to rest. She snatched the rope from his hands and demanded to know why he found it so difficult to relax, saying that it was stupid to work when he should be resting. Leaving that memory behind, Kanso smirked as he remembered the girl telling him exactly that. Now he was wondering if he should take a look at the trophy on the table. It was a magic stone, and it was radiating strong energy. Kanso stared at him, thinking to himself about the invisible alien energy. The people of this civilization seemed to be using the energy of these stones, and he noticed that it was similar to the dark magic used by the followers of the heavenly demon cult. This magic was banned in the magical community because it was obtained through human sacrifice. Throwing this thought aside, the protagonist took the magic stone in his hand and silently told himself that he could not keep such a dangerous object. Now he would seal its energy. After that, he left his room and ran into Sam, who noticed that the protagonist had woken up early. Kanso then asked if Sam was really going to spend his entire day off chopping ingredients. Sam chuckled and explained that he had to be responsible even if it was just chopping onions for tomorrow. He then mentioned that it was the protagonist's first day off and asked what he wanted to do. Kanso crossed his arms over his chest and replied that he was still thinking. Then Sam, with a smile, suggested that they go to the library with Hannah. Kanso looked at him, confused at first, but after a while he and Hannah approached the building. The hero asked if there really were places where anyone could read valuable books, to which the girl replied that she just wanted to leaf through them. Then Kanso put her down on the floor, warning her not to run away and to come back as soon as she chose a book. Then the hero moved the chair and thought to himself that everything here was quite comfortable, especially with a huge number of books. Hannah reached for a book on the shelf when a strange guy approached her and asked if she needed help. He pointed to the book, asking her to get it. The man quickly grabbed the book and handed it to the girl, who thanked him. At that moment, Kanso turned to watch the interaction, studying the man's aura. He thought to himself that the man had probably awakened as well, as his aura was unusually strong for his age. The stranger exhaled heavily, and Kanso, although he didn't know what this man's life was like, could tell that it wasn't easy for him. The hero continued to watch, noting that the man was not as strong as Jenny, but there was something about his abilities that intrigued him. Then he wondered why the man was still in such an insignificant position. Then Hannah, looking at the man with interest, asked if he felt unwell. The surprised man replied that it was written all over his face. The girl explained that even her uncle was worried about him. Then the man turned to her, and in a fit of anger shouted that her uncle was a peddler from the spring pavilion. Kanso, hearing this, came closer to them and asked if the young man knew him. The man extended his hand and replied that Kanso was very popular on social media, that women liked him, and that he was known for delivering goods quickly despite being a walking courier. The man then asked if he could find out what class the protagonist was in. The protagonist replied that he was in Class F, causing the man to exclaim loudly in shock. Sometime later they were sitting at the table, and the man explained that this was how he lived. Kanso rested his chin on his hand, thinking about the situation. He realized that raids were only allowed for people of a certain age, so the man had to make do with whatever work he could find to survive. The man explained that this is why he accepted any job offered to him. He also volunteered at the library, because it helped him earn extra money on top of his scholarship. Then the hero looked thoughtfully at this man, and asked if there really was no one who could help someone with such abilities. The man replied that his grade was C, which was neither good nor bad, and that was why no one sponsored him. He looked at Kanso, adding that he felt like he had no special abilities, and that his mother lived in poverty. Kanso raised his hand, explaining that class doesn't determine everything in his life. Then he asked the man if he really wanted to upgrade his class. The boy's mouth dropped open in surprise, exclaiming that such a thing was impossible. He asked incredulously who told him this. Kanso replied that the man was giving up without even trying, and then asked if he wanted to become stronger. Then the guy clenched his fists, shouting that of course he wanted to, but he didn't know how. In response, Kanso crossed his fingers and calmly stated that he could teach him. Raising his index finger, he added that in return he would ask the man to find information about a specific country. The boy asked out of curiosity what country he meant. Kanso replied that he needed information about the OK dynasty. Then the guy took the book and said that he was hearing about such a condition for the first time, but he would try to find information about it. Kanso thought to himself that if he had traveled through time, there should have been information about the Ok dynasty in history. This seemed to explain why the magic of that dynasty and the magic of the current era were so similar, despite being called by different names. The guy started leafing through the book and read everything he could about this period. When the protagonist asked what he had found, the boy, looking confused, replied that he had gone through all the ancient dynasties. He looked at Kanso and added that there was no mention of a dynasty called OK. Then the man closed the book and repeated that there was no such dynasty. Kanso opened the book and thought to himself that all the dynasty names were similar to their civilizations. However, he had never heard of the Ok dynasty either. At that moment he realized that this meant that there had never been such a dynasty on Earth. The guy, noticing his anxiety, asked if everything was okay. Then Kanso turned away, saying that he was just thinking. He then thanked the boy for his help and told him to come to the spring pavilion where he would treat him to some food. The boy, still confused, replied that it would cost him nothing. After that, they stood up from the table, and the protagonist, as he left, thought that although he did not receive the information he expected, one thing became clear. He did not travel through time and was not bewitched by the mages of the heavenly demon sect. But this made him wonder how he ended up here. Later that night, in the spring pavilion, the hero sat in his room and meditated. His thoughts returned to his childhood, when his father gave him a relic that belonged to his great-grandfather. The boy looked at her in surprise, not understanding what this meant. His father patted him on the head and said that one day he would have to find it, and then he could return home. Leaving the memory behind, Kanso opened his eyes and wondered what this strange memory meant. He told himself that there was no need to rush. Everything would become clear in time. As he continued to think, he heard something strange and wondered what was going on near the restaurant. A fat man was standing at the door, looking around. He then took out a wrench and sat down next to Sam's motorcycle. He muttered quietly under his breath that he would unscrew something to discourage the man from ever riding a motorcycle again. At that moment, a shadow appeared behind him, and when the man spoke, he was reminded that Sullivan had asked him to do it, so it was not his fault. Then Kanso, who was standing behind him, asked who Sullivan was. The man screamed in horror, falling to the ground. Then he asked who the man was. Kanso looked at him and calmly said that it was not good to shout at such a late hour, and that he should be quieter. The shocked hooligan began to rise from his knees, asking who Kanso was. The hero calmly replied that he was a courier from the spring pavilion. When the man stood up, he said that it was good that he was the new courier. He then added that Sullivan intended to propose to the restaurant owner, so the protagonist should start looking for another job. Kanso, with a hint of disdain in his voice, replied that this was stupid. The bully pointed his finger at him and asked if the protagonist was really crazy, wondering why he was so arrogant. The man then asked if he could bring the protagonist back to his senses, and with these words he punched him. Kanso looked at him calmly and grabbed the man's fist with his hand. Cold sweat broke out on the hooligan's body as fear gripped him. He was scared inside, asking himself why this courier was so strong. Then the protagonist noticed that this man would do well to come to his senses. With these words, he placed his fingers on the bully's forehead and hit him hard. The force of the blow was so powerful that the man was thrown backwards, landing with such force that he bounced off the ground. Kanso, now standing over the bully with his hands behind his back, told the man to pass on the message to his stupid Sullivan. He threatened that if Sullivan continued to pick on the spring pavilion, he would be in trouble. The boy, now terrified, screamed as he ran away, grabbed his cap and ran out of the restaurant in horror. Meanwhile, Sullivan, the same man who had recently worked as a courier for Sam, stood leaning against the wall, holding the phone in his hand, gritting his teeth, wondering why the guy hadn't called him yet. At that moment, one guy ran up to him, shouting loudly that Donovan was back and needed to be examined. One of the men supported Donovan by the arm, as he was having difficulty moving on his own. Sullivan then asked what had happened, and moving closer to the man, added that he had given him a chance, but it seemed he had failed again. All Donovan had to do was loosen the nuts on the motorcycle, and yet he had come back defeated. Donovan dropped to his knees in front of Sullivan, screaming for him to listen. He shouted that the new delivery man at the restaurant was no ordinary man, that this was the first time he had encountered such a monster. He explained that the delivery man had warned them not to go near the spring pavilion, or he would make them regret it. In response, Sullivan frowned in disbelief, shouting that it was no wonder the man was injured. But Donovan insisted, shouting that the courier was indeed a monster. Then Sullivan, after thinking for a moment, said that although the protagonist might be strong, they would go together and teach him a lesson. Looking at his phone, he decided that they needed to gather everyone and go look at the courier. Meanwhile, the main character was carrying 2 bags of food in his hands, and he placed them on the ground in front of the men. As he began to take out the food, he raised his head and asked where he could pick up the dishes later. At that moment, the bully walked up to the main character and, clenching his fists, shouted that the main character still didn't understand anything. Smiling, he said that the protagonist would have to work with them because they claimed that Kanso had beaten Donovan up good. He kicked the courier's bag and shouted that the protagonist had really upset Sullivan. Kanso stood in front of them, looking over their shoulders and asking if it was the same Donovan standing behind them. Then Donovan, clearly frightened, shouted that he had given everything to these people. The other guy turned the protagonist to face him, gritting his teeth, and demanded to know what he was muttering under his breath. He reached for the courier's helmet, shouting threateningly for him to take it off. Kanso frowned and looked at him, clearly angry. He grabbed the bandit's hand, telling him that he didn't advise such a weakling to talk like that to someone stronger. The man began to twitch his hand in fear, begging Kanso to let him go. Kanso twisted the man's arm and warned that Donovan must have already given them his warning. The man's face turned blue in pain as he screamed, looking at his arm. Then Kanso, enveloped in mana, said that he would have to teach the men a good lesson. After a while, he entered the restaurant, announcing that he was back. Sam noticed he was a little late and asked who had ordered so early, wondering out loud if it was really the jocks. After a short silence, Kanso replied that people just like to eat. He added that the men liked it so much that they even washed the dishes themselves. Sam looked at him in shock, asking if they had washed the plates at all. Taking the plate, he noticed that it was very shiny. Then Kanso, wanting to ask a favor, asked if Sam knew a man named Sullivan and what his relationship was to this man. A bead of sweat appeared on Sam's face as he asked Kanso how he knew about Sullivan. He explained that this man had been a courier before him, but he had always slacked off while demanding a higher salary. The hero then crossed his arms over his chest and stated that he had a conflict with Sullivan, adding that one of the visitors was his acquaintance. He continued by explaining that they had behaved inappropriately, so he had to teach them a little lesson. Sam thought to himself with horror that if Kanso was so strong, he must have taught them much more than just a small lesson. As it turned out, that time the main character took one of the hooligans by the hand and squeezed it tightly, causing the man to scream in pain. His comrade waved his hand and ordered them to grab him. Then Kanso, letting go of the bully's hand, swung his own, releasing an incredibly powerful stream of magical energy. The wind was so strong that it knocked all the bullies off their feet. Donovan, sitting on the ground, looked at Ben, whose hand Kanso was still squeezing with all his strength. Distracted by this, Donovan noticed that the protagonist was now standing directly above him. The man then crawled back with tears in his eyes, claiming that they would get into trouble if they did not leave. At that moment, Kanso extended 2 fingers, shrouded in his magical power, and struck Ben with them. Ben begged for mercy, and was ordered to repeat after the protagonist, who demanded that he say that he would never harm the owners of the Spring Pavilion again. Ben repeated these words with tears in his eyes, screaming them out in horror. As soon as he finished, Kanso removed his hand, and Ben fell to the ground, crying bitterly. After which the protagonist rose to his feet. He noted that, in addition to this man, they still had to deal with the leader. Donovan, now even more frightened, picked Ben up and asked if the protagonist meant Sullivan. He explained that the boss was watching from the sidelines, but did not know exactly where Sullivan was. At this moment, Sullivan, hiding behind the barrels, thought to himself that he needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. He started to run, but the main character immediately noticed him. Meanwhile, Sullivan ran into the alley, trying to hide. He turned around and asked himself if it was true that now he would not be able to escape from the main character. Suddenly, Kanso appeared in front of him, asking if he managed to run so far. The man screamed in fear, saying that the protagonist had scared him. He then pointed at Kanso, asking who he was and why he was attacking people over what he called a harmless joke. Sullivan, introducing himself as a gangster, threatened to call the police. Kanso then stepped towards him, asking what other pranks Sullivan had in mind when he came in the middle of the night to sabotage the motorcycle. In response, Sullivan raised his fist, screaming what would happen if he did that to him. Kanso extended his hand and replied that the diseased branches should be cut off before they infect the entire tree. The shadow of his hand fell across Sullivan's face, and in horror, he ordered them not to come near him. The next second, a loud scream echoed through the alley. Meanwhile, Sam was sitting at the table peeling onions. Suddenly, he received a message and picked up the phone to see an apology from Sullivan. At that moment, Kanso approached the table, asking if Sullivan had sent the message. Sam looked up and confirmed that it was, adding that Sullivan had said that he would stop being such a freak and go back to his village and work on the farm. Then, throwing up his hands in surprise, Sam asked how the main character managed to raise such a stubborn goat. Kanso, smiling, replied that he was just talking to him. He added to himself that while Sullivan might have been an asshole, he had once been part of the Spring Pavilion team, and Kanso was glad he had come to his senses. At that moment, Jenny entered the restaurant and greeted everyone. Sam apologized for calling her on his day off. However, Jenny smiled and said that she didn't have any plans for the day anyway. Sam then scratched his head, saying they were short-handed since his wife and Hannah went to a kindergarten event, Kanso adding that today was tree planting day. In response, Jenny smirked and said that her younger brother was also going to plant trees today as a charity event. The protagonist asked if her brother was interested in volunteering, to which the girl smiled shyly and said that he was just very kind. Then she laughed and shouted that they needed to get to work. But Jenny thought to herself that this guy was annoying her because he kept asking such awkward questions. Later, the boys were sitting at the table enjoying a pleasant conversation. Sam mentioned that Hannah and Sarah would probably have fun, as it was unusual for no one to be home and they were feeling a bit lonely. He then took a deep breath and noted that new portals had been opening in the mountains lately. Expressing hope that his people would remain safe, Jenny raised her index finger and assured him that the Hunters Association would guarantee the safety of the festival, so he didn't have to worry. She added that the inspection of the Rostachek kindergarten was also under the supervision of the association, and strong hunters were appointed to ensure that everything went smoothly. Sam, feeling more confident, smiled and asked how Jenny knew all this. He noted that he had worked as a loader for the association for a long time, but had never heard of such details. Jenny responded by screaming loudly, causing the others to look at her in confusion. She winked playfully and said that it was a secret, so she couldn't reveal it. Meanwhile, the pink-haired boy who was riding in the car let out a heavy sigh and said that he could no longer enjoy the day off in good weather, wondering out loud why he was called today. He waved his hand dismissively, stating that Jenny was supposed to be at the event, and the woman sitting next to him adjusted her glasses and explained that the young lady had urgent business to attend to, so she had sent the least useful person in her place. According to her, it was easy to guess that Jenny meant the young master. Then the guy clicked his tongue in disappointment and exhaled, expressing disbelief. At this point, the woman remarked with a slight smile that she hoped the young gentleman understood the purpose of attending this event. She explained that an important and influential person from the association would be present, and this was the boy's chance to make an impression. She mentioned that she was referring to Sawyer, the only producer of S-class artifacts in the entire country. The guy then looked out the window with displeasure, asking if he really was just going to impress someone. The woman replied that the master had a business meeting and asked if he had read the additional materials she had sent him. The guy turned to her, crying out in surprise, asking what other materials she was talking about. Then the woman calmly explained that if he continued in the same spirit, she would be forced to report everything to the lady. The guy then yelled at her not to say anything, claiming she would kill him. Literally, not figuratively, in response. The woman adjusted her glasses again and asked him not to exaggerate. She reminded him that it was very important for him to make a good impression on Sawyer. She added that finding an awakened level 0 was as important as establishing a relationship with the famous artifact master. She then started pushing the boy on the shoulder, urging him to hurry up since they had already arrived. She shouted that they should quickly greet Sawyer. The worried boy asked if he could just walk up to him directly. He then walked up behind Sawyer, cleared his throat, and introduced himself as Christian of the Red Dragon Guild, mentioning that his father spoke highly of the master. Sawyer turned to him and asked if he was Howard's son, and the boy extended his hand and confirmed, saying it was an honor to meet him. Sawyer responded politely, stating that it was nice to meet him, but pointing forward, he added that if that was all, then Christian should go and enjoy the event. He turned away and told Christian not to interfere with his communication with his grandson. Then Christian, thinking to himself, realized that the rumors were true. Sawyer was a rather unpleasant person. Sawyer's grandson then ran up to Christian and bowed, apologizing for the teacher not always being prepared for such situations. The woman, Mary, made eye contact with Christian, and said she expected nothing less from him. And the guy, outraged, noted that Jenny knew everything but still sent him away. He asked where his sister had gone on such an important day, leaving all her responsibilities on her younger brother. Mary explained that the girl had gone to spend time with her idol. Meanwhile, the protagonist carved a neat rabbit out of wood. Then he asked Hannah if she was upset that there was no shovel with the rabbit. When he finished, he gave the carved rabbit to the girl, telling her that now she would have it. Hannah took the figurine with great joy. But now Hannah looked at the ground with tears in her eyes. Her rabbit on the shovel was broken into 2 pieces. The other children, confused, asked what they should do. Then Sawyer, hearing the screams, noticed that Hannah was crying and screaming that her uncle had made a rabbit for her, but now it was broken. The old man came up and asked if she wanted her grandfather to fix it. Hannah looked at him, asking if he could really do it. The old man reassured her by saying that of course he could. He took the shovel and the broken part of the rabbit, saying that Grandpa could do anything. Looking at the carved rabbit, he was amazed by the craftsmanship and wondered to himself who had made such a skillful piece. At that moment, a man appeared behind him, announcing that his scroll had arrived, and the old man turned to him, asking him to come and look at the item. He showed it to the man, asking if any of his students could reproduce such fine work. The man replied that it would be difficult to create something like that. Sawyer then looked at Hannah and remarked that her uncle must really love her. A happy Hannah replied that she loved her uncle too. Sawyer then carefully put the 2 halves of the rabbit back together, explaining that her uncle had worked hard on it and would fix it. Having connected the parts, he breathed on the spatula, and in a moment it was whole again. He returned the spatula to Hannah and told her that everything was ready. The girl was overjoyed and thanked her grandfather. Christian, who was watching this scene, crossed his arms over his chest. He noticed that this master did not care about anything, but needed the right approach. Suddenly his eyes lit up as he came up with a plan. He looked at Mary and said he had an idea. He instructed her to inform the team of assistants that they were changing their strategy regarding Master Sawyer. The girl bowed and assured him that it would be done. Recently, the protagonist has developed a habit of going to the bakery immediately after receiving his isolationist allowance to buy a delicious bun that he first tried during his training. He opened the door, greeted the owner, and asked if there were any more rolls left. The owner greeted him warmly, and Kanso walked around the room, looking around. He approached the owner again and asked if the rolls were sold out yet. The owner replied that they had all been sold long ago, but then with a smile, he pulled out one, saying that he had saved it especially for him. Kanso extended his hand to him, expressing that he had always helped him out, for which he was grateful. The owner handed him a box of rolls, reminding him that if he did not finish it all in a day, he should remember to put it in the refrigerator. Then Kanso, thanking the owner, headed towards the exit. Opening the door, he saw a girl approaching and let her go ahead. She immediately headed to the checkout. The owner, clearly embarrassed, remarked that the weather was fine today. Kanso watched them out of the corner of his eye before leaving. After some time, the main character found himself at home. He opened the refrigerator and put the roll inside. Meanwhile, Kurongi sat in his arms, drooling as she looked at the food. The hero gently poked the rat on the nose, telling her that she had already eaten her piece of roll, if she wanted. They could have another roll together for breakfast the next day. Later that night, the protagonist lay on his back with Kurongi fast asleep next to him. She heard a strange noise and, feeling that something was wrong, moved her ears. Then the rat got out of bed and quietly left the room. She slightly opened the door and, reaching the refrigerator, jumped onto the shelf with desserts. Coming closer, she brought her paw to her mouth in confusion, realizing that the roll was no longer there. At that moment, Kanso came up behind her, calling the rat's name. Kurongi turned to him and squealed loudly in surprise. The next morning, Sam smiled and asked if she had really eaten the entire roll by herself. The hero replied that Kurongi denied it, but it was obvious who the culprit was. At that moment, the door of the restaurant opened, and a man stood up from the table. He looked forward, asking if it was Connor. The man walked into the restaurant, and when he saw him, he made eye contact with them. Then Sam looked at Connor, asking what brought him here. Connor smiled as he held out the bag and explained that he had come with beer. In response, Sam smiled and said that he shouldn't have bought the beer, and then asked who he had brought the roll for. Connor explained that he had a serious matter to discuss with Sam, and he had brought beer as a sort of bribe. Then Sam took the bag and, noticing the worried expression on the man's face, asked what happened, at which point Connor began to nervously fidget with his fingers, and then asked how Sam confessed his love to his wife. He continued to explain that the girl who came to his bakery was very beautiful and sweet, and he had been in love with her for 3 months. He sighed heavily, admitting that he didn't know what to do. The man was afraid that if he confessed his love to her, Missy would start avoiding him. so the hero advised Connor to stop thinking too much, reminding him that it would take a little time before the situation would become unbearable. Suddenly, Connor started crying, lamenting how such a wonderful girl could even agree to go on a date with him. Sam shouted in irritation, asking what he was even worried about because it didn't matter. Then Connor, overwhelmed with emotion, began to bang his head on the table and cry. Then Sam wondered out loud what to do with him. He suggested the man go home and get some sleep. Kanso added that Connor could sleep in his room. Sam hesitated for a moment, asking if that would be too much trouble. Kanso smiled, assuring Sam that he always put the role aside for him alone, and he wanted to repay him. After some time, the hero brought Connor to his room and laid him on the bed. At that moment, Korongi opened one eye and looked away. Kanso turned in the same direction, asking what happened. The rat started jumping around anxiously, prompting the guy to ask what was wrong. When they got to the kitchen, the refrigerator door was slightly open. Kanso walked up to him, opened the door and was shocked to find a fairy eating food from the refrigerator. The hero shouted threateningly, asking what the fairy was doing there. The fairy turned around in surprise at the sound of his voice and, covered in bun crumbs, looked at him. When the morning came, the protagonist was sitting at the table with everyone else. The fairy was standing on the table when Kanso asked her if it was really her who ate his sweet bun. The fairy shyly explained that her name was Dorothy, and that she deeply regretted what she had done. Sam was stunned and asked how the flower fairy ended up in their kitchen. As they were usually drawn to flowers or honey, Connor pointed and suggested that she was probably attracted to honey. Kanso, confused, asked what exactly a flower fairy was. Sam explained that fairies were humanoid spirits that lived in portals. With the advent of portals, they began to settle in cities. Although the magical monsters were destroyed, no one harmed the fairies, as they did not pose a threat to people, and sometimes even helped, so they found their place in protected cities. Hearing this, Kanso extended his hand and asked if fairies were like their squeaker. Sam smiled widely, confirming that they were, but added that sometimes there were unpleasant fairies, although they still did not pose a serious threat. Hearing this, the hero looked with displeasure at the very upset fairy. Crossing his arms over his chest, he declared that he would forgive her this time, but reminded her not to steal from anyone again. Dorothy, clearly frightened, raised her hands and apologized. Admitting that she was ashamed, she explained that she was simply hungry after hard work and wanted to eat. At this point, Sam asked if she really wanted to work for them. Sarah, still hesitating, asked how a flower fairy could help in a Chinese restaurant. Then Connor looked at the protagonist, suggesting that she could be of use to him. Sam turned to his friend and noted that it seemed like they were shifting their responsibility onto him. In response, Kanso smiled and asked if he could train the fairy and in exchange hire her. At that moment, Sarah imagined a man's beautiful body and joyfully exclaimed that it was a brilliant idea, as a man in good shape would definitely win women's hearts. Connor scratched his cheek in confusion, admitting that he had neglected his appearance for a long time, which caused him to lack self-confidence. Hearing this, the protagonist smiled and said that he would finally have someone to train with. Later, Kanso, Sarah, and Jenny arrived at the supermarket. The hero looked at the woman and asked why they came, adding that she asked them not to tell Sam or Hannah. Then Sarah explained that the day after tomorrow was her husband's birthday. Jenny clapped her hands happily, exclaiming that it was the boss's birthday. The woman crossed her arms over her chest with a confused look. She wanted to buy him a gift, but wasn't sure what to give him. Then Jenny took her hand and reassured her, telling her not to worry as she would help, while Jenny thought to herself that she had never imagined such a situation before, even with friends. She then looked at the protagonist, realizing that this was also a shopping trip with Kanso. Even though they were with Sarah, she still felt like they were on a date. Sarah also looked at the protagonist and asked him not to tell her husband anything, adding that they would hide the gifts in his room. Then the protagonist assured her that he understood everything. He then asked what gift she was planning to give her husband. The woman explained that she was thinking about buying him shoes, but she wasn't sure he would actually wear them. Jenny then raised her finger and suggested that they buy him some vitamins or supplements, since the boss had been looking very tired lately. Sarah was very pleased with the idea, admitting that Jenny was always better at choosing gifts. After that, the girls went to choose everything they needed. While the main character stood to the side, looking away, he noticed that the girls nearby were whispering, looking at him. He finally walked up to his friends and asked if he could leave. Hearing this, Jenny raised her hands in protest, insisting that he couldn't leave. She then put glasses on the boy's face, saying that people wouldn't be able to see how handsome he was. After that, they continued their shopping. Jenny went up to the display window pointing to a large teddy bear, and said that Hannah would definitely like it. Kanso agreed with her. But it was at that moment that a strange, powerful aura caught his attention. A loud cry of pain echoed throughout the store, followed by frantic shouts ordering customers to stay in their seats. People began to shout that there were illegals in the store. Kanso asked who these people were, and Jenny explained that they were awakened people who used their abilities for crimes. The guards immediately pointed their guns at the thief, and Kanso, noticing the blue aura surrounding the intruder, realized that not all awakened people had the same aura color. He found it odd that the thief didn't seem to know that the mall's security had activated the barrier, meaning no one could leave unless they were involved in setting it up. Kanso then asked why they would commit a crime knowing this, suggesting that perhaps they had some other plan. Jenny replied that it could be a diversion, allowing them to investigate other potential targets. The hero then closed his eyes and asked if there were any magic stones stored in the basement of the building. Jenny confirmed that in such a large shopping mall, there would most likely be a lot of Class A stones. She started waving her arms, assuring him that security had everything under control and would sort it out. Then Sarah, looking anxiously at her phone, mentioned that they would be late picking up Hannah from preschool. The girl sitting in the kindergarten was visibly upset, and the main character, feeling that he had no choice, decided to help the security service. He told Jenny to stay with Sarah and, pointing to the side, added that he needed to go to the toilet for a moment. The girl looked at him, advising him to be careful. Kanso quickly ran to the side, finding himself behind a wall, where he saw several corpses. He wondered out loud what had happened, but when he touched them, he realized that they were still alive. Although in critical condition, he provided first aid, but they were barely able to stand on their feet. The hero then continued down the corridor, looking into an open room where a man with a sword was pointing at people, ordering them to move. Kanso felt a strange aura coming from him, a power unlike anything he had encountered before. Wondering what to do next, he walked into the room, knocking down everyone inside with one deft movement. The hero quickly walked past the people standing at the computers, bending over their bodies, thinking about how he would get information, although he had no one to interrogate. Determined to find out what had happened through rumors, the hero raised his head and declared that he would leave the rest of the investigation to associations. Meanwhile, the girl turned to the people around her and shouted that the people dressed in black were just a distraction that allowed others to steal the stones. She turned to the man and asked him to detain those involved in the theft from the store. Without a second's hesitation, she jumped down and ordered the two men to follow her into the basement. All three of them ran quickly, and she held a knife in her hand. Soon the girl pressed herself against the wall, trying to move silently. Suddenly she turned sharply, looked into the office and shouted at the people inside to stay put. But soon, looking at the bodies lying on the ground, she asked what had happened there, wondering out loud who could have dealt with all the robbers. Meanwhile, Kanso stood in front of Sam and noticed that it was his birthday and he was busy with work. Sam, yawning, casually asked what was so special about birthdays. After all, it was just a person's birthday. However, the hero objected, saying that no one's day could be ordinary. At that moment, Hannah and Sarah happily entered the room, carrying a cake and congratulating him on his birthday. The girl excitedly raised her hands, joyfully congratulating her father. Following this, Connor and Jenny entered the restaurant and asked if they were late. Sam, touched by this sight, burst into tears, and Hannah asked him to quickly blow out the candles. A few days later, Sam announced that today was a holiday, and Kanso, peeling onions, asked if it was Children's Day. Turning around, Sam confirmed that it was, and since it was a weekend, they would probably make some good money that day. The hero quickly peeled another onion and explained that he had read that the day was dedicated to children, adding that Hannah was a child too. Then Sam mentioned that he was planning to take Hannah to a magic show after dinner. He put his hand to his chin thoughtfully, wondering how they would have managed if Jenny hadn't been there today, and Kanso extended his hand, assuring him that he had called for a replacement. As soon as he said this, the door of the restaurant opened and a guy walked in, greeting everyone. Sam looked at the newcomer and asked if he had all the necessary documents, including a certificate of guardianship and a medical certificate. The guy immediately handed over everything necessary. Pointing to the dirty dishes, Sam told the boy to wash his hands first and then wash the dishes. The boy quickly completed the task, and Sam praised him, saying that he worked very quickly. He noted that it was clear that the boy was awakened. Kanso looked at the boy and explained that it was not easy, as he delivered newspapers every day and learned through hard work. He lowered his head, acknowledging that even an awakened person must train his skills. The man raised his head in surprise and asked himself why Jenny, who was a G-class, was so much more agile than this boy. Meanwhile, Jenny was sitting in the car, looking unhappy. Her subordinate Mary was sitting in the front, and she mentioned that they would be arriving soon. She said that once they got out, Jenny should first greet the president, then the association chairman, and after that she needed to talk to the other guild directors. The girl replied that she understood everything, and then asked about her father. Mary explained that he had promised to pay a short visit, and Jenny reached into her bag and remarked that he must be very busy. She mentioned that it was Children's Day, and asked why she had to come to a corporate party with such dark loud makeup and a red suit. Mary then turned around, and explained that the color red symbolized their Red Dragon Guild, so they had to be patient. The guild had to serve as an example for the children to follow, and an object of aspiration. As Jenny applied her lipstick, she asked what aspirations or examples they could set when they could barely cope with each new portal. And yet here they were, talking about these things. She looked into the small mirror and noted that, however, this country owed its well-being and security to them, since their world was constantly balancing on the edge of the abyss. Mary then reminded her not to forget her status, emphasizing that Jenny was the most beautiful and representative face of the guild, the Witch of the Red Flame. Hearing this, Jenny became very tense, and the lipstick slid down her cheek. Mary, noticing this, took out a napkin and said that it was quite natural for an awakened person from an established family to be as beautiful as Jenny, so there was no need to be embarrassed about it. Jenny wiped off her lipstick and thought to herself that in the past, she had simply wanted to look older, so that she would not be neglected because of her age, but now this bright makeup had become an integral part of her image. Mary, who had been watching Jenny out of the corner of her eye, asked how her hobby of playing lower-class women was going, and an excited Jenny insisted that she was working undercover to protect civilians in case of an emergency. The girl listened carefully before pulling out a piece of paper, assuming that it was simply because Jenny had a favorite pastime, an outlet outside of work and guild affairs. A few minutes later their car stopped. Mary got out first and opened the door for Jenny. The girl got out of the car and thought to herself with a smile on her face that it had been a long time since she had been a hunter. Meanwhile, the main character walked through the mall holding Hannah's hand. The guy walking next to them noticed an interesting quest and called out to Kanso. Kanso turned around and saw the boy pointing at the dart game. Fearing the worst, he stepped aside, thinking that the assassins were training here in broad daylight. Hannah, however, told him that it was just a game. Then the hero realized that these were the same entertaining games that the people of this civilization enjoyed. The guy explained that for every burst balloon, points were awarded. Hannah then pointed ahead and mentioned that the grand prize was a teddy bear. The hero knelt down and asked the girl if she really wanted this toy. The girl smiled and happily replied that if she had such a teddy bear, she would be very happy and would not even want sweets. The protagonist then asked her how about some chocolates. Hannah covered her mouth with her hands and thought for a moment before exclaiming that she wanted to eat all kinds of delicious things, including chocolate. The hero then turned to the boy and asked if he could try the game, hoping it would help him become friends with Hannah. The boy awkwardly scratched the back of his head and said he would be glad to, but he was an awakened person with a rather useless explosive ability. He explained that while it wasn't very strong for a C-class, it could cause a small explosion, enough to briefly blind and distract the monster. He sighed in confusion and added that this ability was of little use in everyday life. However, Kanso assured him that there was nothing to worry about and suggested that he try to do as he was told. He approached the station and asked the man for 3 darts. Upon receiving them, the guy expressed his bewilderment, wondering how he could possibly hit the 100-point target with all 3 darts. The hero then instructed him to stand steady and tense his core muscles, explaining that if he were unsteady while throwing, the dart's center of gravity would be shifted. He added that the shoulders and wrists should remain relaxed, and the dart should be aimed slightly higher when aiming. Finally, he stressed the importance of concentration. The boy then threw the dart at the target, and, to his amazement, hit the 100-point mark. He jumped for joy, screaming with excitement. Hannah, delighted, picked up the big teddy bear and hugged it tightly. At that moment, a voice announced over the loudspeaker that the show of the powerful wizard Kung-Kul was about to begin, and asked everyone to take their seats. The girl looked at her uncle and excitedly shouted that the illusion show was starting and they needed to run. Kanso turned around and smiled as he watched her run forward. He shouted for her to be careful not to fall. Meanwhile, the guys in black masks were holding bags in their hands. One of them asked if they were really putting themselves in danger. Another guy shouted that when the order came from above, they had no choice. He added menacingly that if they did not kill all these people, they themselves would be killed. The second guy, looking scared, asked what would happen if they were caught. His companion, raising his hand, reassured him not to be afraid, explaining that even if powerful awakened seekers were to look for them, they would not be able to find them. The guy took a deep breath and asked if the blood flower was really their only goal. They pointed their weapons forward, and the first guy ordered his colleague to look for a target. The boy, who was watching the scene closely, thought that the pink-haired girl must be the one they were hunting. He aimed at Jenny, and realizing this, thought that it was her, the Red Flame Witch, and that she must die. Meanwhile, Hannah was standing near one of the chairs, waving and shouting at the guys to come over as it was a good spot. The boy, still unsure, asked Kanso if they should sit there, since they would have a good view of the levitation tricks from there. In response, Kanso crossed his arms over his chest and said that he could do it himself. However, seeing the boy's confused expression, he added that he was joking. The boy laughed and said that his favorite trick was when someone was cut in half and then put back together. The hero, surprised, wondered out loud if they really had such tricks where a body could be cut up and then put back together. The young man explained that even when you know it's just a trick, it still looks very convincing. Kanso then replied that he didn't even know if it could really be called a trick. Suddenly something caught his attention. He looked around, feeling a familiar aura, and thought that it might be Jenny. Soon he noticed a woman with an aura emanating from her. He pointed towards her and asked who she was. The young man replied that these were VIP seats, and pointed to the woman, saying that she was an important person. He enthusiastically explained that it was Black Rose. He added that in South Korea, not knowing her would be considered suspicious, even as if she were a spy. Kanso thought to himself that she must be a very powerful hunter to be so well known. The boy confirmed this, explaining that she was the best hunter of the Red Dragon Guild, one of the 3 main guilds. Then the hero looked at Jenny, and thought that she seemed like a high-class girl. Jenny, who was nervously clutching a piece of paper in her hands, didn't understand why the people from the Spring Pillar were here, although she enjoyed watching Kanso. He, on the other hand, thought with a slight smile that Jenny probably had her own reasons for hiding her identity. Meanwhile, the host began to present a great illusion show. His voice was full of joy. The magician began to juggle boxes. The hero rubbed his chin thoughtfully, wondering how objects moved without magic. Suddenly, a bullet seemed to come out of nowhere and hit his temple. He quickly turned his gaze to her, and used his aura to reflect the bullet. The next bullet hit the protective glass. Jenny immediately asked what happened. One of the guards excitedly shouted that these were aura-charged ammunition. Meanwhile, the snipers fired 2 more bullets. The guards quickly raised their shields, shouting that they needed to increase the shield power to protect the lady. The bullets kept hitting the shield, and the guards were shouting that the bullets were going through the shield, but they had to find a way to stop it. One of the guards, puzzled, asked what kind of bullets these were that could penetrate the strongest energy shields. He was afraid of who might be responsible for this, and why it was happening. Meanwhile, Jenny stepped forward, deciding to open the shield herself. The guard looked at Black Rose in surprise. Jenny, irritated, asked why they were still sitting there, asking if they were going to look for the criminals. She didn't understand what was happening and what happened to her friends from the restaurant. Meanwhile, organizers began calling for evacuation in a certain direction. Sarah hugged Hannah and asked if she was scared. She tried to calm her down, assuring her that her mother was there. The girl showed her the teddy bear and said that it was injured. Then Hannah ran to Sam. The hero, tense, thought about the girl who cried because of them. He decided to find them and make them pay for it. He turned to his companions and said that he needed to go to the toilet and would be back soon, as it seemed the danger had passed. At this point, one of the snipers, not noticing Kanso's appearance, asked his partner what he had done, since he was supposed to kill this red fox with 1 shot. His partner explained that he had aimed straight at the head, but for some reason the bullet had bounced off. Kanso was surprised that it was worth arguing about. One of the snipers asked excitedly what they should do now, suggesting that they could shoot a civilian to cause panic and escape in the noise. His partner, however, doubted whether it was worth doing. Meanwhile, Kanso, beginning to get angry, could not come to terms with the idea that they would shoot at civilians. Then he pulled out the cartridges, deciding to return them to the snipers. An aura surrounded him as he waved his hand and sent bullets towards them. One sniper was wounded in the side, the other in the back. Both soldiers immediately fell, screaming in pain. The hero calmly looked at the wounded, thinking that not only Hannah was crying because of them, but now they were trying to shoot at civilians too. One of the snipers, kneeling, muttered that he didn't know who this man was, but their boss would definitely not forgive him for this. Kanso then immediately asked who their boss was. He frowned when he heard someone calling for them to run. The moment he jumped off the roof, he thought that the hunters from the association would soon deal with this. He then headed back, feeling obligated to reassure Hannah. Meanwhile, Sora, the woman who worked at the kindergarten, smiled as she looked at the children playing at the table. She decided to check her phone and was shocked by the news she saw. Nervously, she patted one of the girls on the head and told them that they would be back soon, so they should wait and behave. Then she hurried towards the exit. Sora answered the call, telling the person on the other end that she understood. This could well have been an attempt by illegal immigrants, so children need extra security. The caller thanked her for taking on this task, even though it was the inspection department's task. At that moment, the children came out the door calling her. Then Sora asked them to wait, and talking on the phone, promised to call back. She then walked into the classroom and apologized for keeping them waiting. She asked the children if they knew what day it was tomorrow. They all replied that tomorrow was Parents' Day. Sora smiled, telling them that it was the correct answer. Then she explained that today they would make paper carnations to show their gratitude to their parents. The children enthusiastically began cutting out paper flowers. Sora complimented Hannah on how beautifully she carved her flower and asked who she would give it to. Hannah replied that she would give it to her mom and dad. The girl sitting next to her raised her hand, exclaiming that she would do the same. And the boys at the next table said that they were making flowers for their mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa. However, one of the boys sat quietly, and Sora, noticing this, looked at John with concern. She sat down next to him and said that his carnation was also very beautiful. Then another boy asked if he had someone to give his carnation to. The children began to discuss that John actually had no one to give him to, since he had no parents and lived with his aunt. One of the boys reluctantly said that his mother forced him to be friends with John, but he didn't want to. Sora immediately hugged the boy who was barely holding back his tears, thinking that she shouldn't have said anything. Then suddenly Hannah jumped up from her chair and screamed that they were all bad boys. She ran up to their table saying that if they didn't have a mom and dad, they should just imagine what it would be like to be asked questions about who they were making carnations for. At that moment, John began to cry, and the other boys immediately followed suit, saying that they did not want to be left without their mom and dad. Sora then tried to calm the children down by reminding them what they should do if they did something wrong. The children responded that they should apologize. She then suggested that they apologize to John and promise never to say such things again. John heard the boys apologizing to him and forgave them quite quickly. Then Hannah smiled and said that they had better stop crying and go make carnations together. John replied that he would give the carnation to his aunt. Hannah, smiling happily, assured him that his aunt would be very pleased. The boy, embarrassed by all the attention, simply nodded. Meanwhile, Mary walked down the corridor, lost in thoughts about the guild leader Howard. He was an A-class awakened, one of the great warriors who emerged during the Age of Chaos. He mastered both the magic sword and fire magic, and played an important role in winning the war against the monsters. Mary then looked at the sign next to the door and sighed, thinking that this was the greatest guild in South Korea. Sometimes Howard's presence scared her. She knocked on the door, silently hoping that she wouldn't make a mistake today, and as she entered the office, she greeted the man and began to look through the papers on his desk. Mary informed him that she was going to read him his schedule for the day, noting that he had a meeting with the president in a few hours after lunch. But the man interrupted her, asking her to wait. He then inquired about the progress of the investigation into the assassination attempt on his daughter, and the use of aura-infused ammunition. Mary replied that the Silver Tower group was currently under suspicion, but there was no news yet. Howard slammed his fist on the table, cursed, and demanded that they find the people behind the attempt on his daughter's life, emphasizing that it must be done as quickly as possible, and at any cost. Mary assured him that she could handle it. Then she mentioned that she had brought the materials he asked for from the Spring Pavilion restaurant. Howard then began looking through the newspapers, noting that the owner of the restaurant was a man he once considered a friend. He remembered how this man helped him explore the dungeons and was a talented chef. Then Mary adjusted her glasses and asked what he was going to do with it. Howard clutched the papers tightly, confused by her question. He explained that after his wife's death, Jenny had lived only for revenge, and this was the first time she had been interested in anything else. He folded his hands together and added that he had always been kind to the restaurant owner and was now just looking out for them. He told her not to take any action against him. Dismissing the secretary, he watched as the door slammed shut. Then Howard pushed his chair back from the desk and reached for the safe. As he dialed the code to open it, he thought about how the paper flower he was about to take out was the first carnation from Jenny. Whenever he looked at it, all his tiredness and irritation seemed to melt away. He hoped that one day his daughter would smile again like she did when she was a child. Meanwhile, the young man ran towards Kanso, who was sweeping the street. He asked if the man was finishing his work. Kanso replied that the young man had arrived earlier than usual. The boy then explained that, thanks to his training, he was able to deliver the same number of newspapers in less time, and he expressed his gratitude, although Kanso believed that the boy's improvement was due to his own efforts, and that he had only given advice. The young man admitted that he had been depressed for a long time, thinking that his life would remain ordinary and boring. However, after training with Kanso, he felt that he was capable of achieving anything he wanted. He had no idea that the dart-throwing technique Kanso taught him would help him develop his abilities so much. Kanso did not quite understand what the boy meant, which prompted the boy to explain. He explained that his dart-throwing technique was very useful to him. Kanso, however, meant something else. He was concerned about the youth's mentality, explaining that the boy would forever remain a C-class if he did not change his approach. The young man was puzzled, asking if it was not obvious that the chances of a second awakening were practically non-existent. He went on to explain that even if someone experiences a second awakening, there is no guarantee that their class will rise. Then Kanso, tightly gripping the handle of the broom, thought that the young man was wrong. Awakening was only the beginning. He wondered if the people of this civilization could not understand this concept. He then asked the boy about his knowledge of breathing techniques. The boy, confused, asked what he meant. Kanso then scanned the boy, and realized that the awakened in this civilization did not know the proper methods of controlling their energy, which explained why they were so ineffective at it. Suddenly the boy perked up, realizing that it was getting late. He decided to leave, as he had to make the last delivery. However, the hero was still slightly perplexed. Later, Kanzo returned to the cafe, sitting opposite Sam, sipping a soda. Finally, Sam couldn't hold back any longer and asked what seemed to be bothering the guy. Kanzo then crossed his arms over his chest and asked Sam what he would do if he knew the secret to making all the awakened ones much stronger. Sam replied that if he knew such a secret, he would share it with them. Kanzo then asked if Sam would like anything in return. The man replied that if his home and family were protected by even stronger awakened ones, that would be enough. He explained that the secret would not only benefit him, since he was unable to protect his country or civilization, but he also did not want Hannah to live in a safe place. Kanzo understood and smiled slightly as Sam handed him another glass of soda. He thought about how he had lived quietly undercover for a long time, not wanting to wreak havoc on this world. He drank the soda in one gulp and smiled again, thinking that sharing this secret with the whole world would make everything more orderly, and that was exactly what he wanted. So the hero decided to develop a breathing technique for the awakened. When it was late evening, Kanzo sat down at a small table. An open notebook lay in front of him. He was actively writing in the notebook with a pencil. After a while, he took a deep breath, thinking that he had not slept for 2 nights and was finally finished. He crossed his arms over his chest, thinking about how this technique would allow the awakened to concentrate their aura into their bodies and prevent it from being lost. Then the hero closed the notebook and called the technique the method of a pure and righteous heart. He rubbed the back of his head, muttering to himself that the only thing left to do was find a way to spread this method. Kanzo remembered his conversation with Jenny when he asked her to tell him about the president of the Hunters Association and what kind of person he was. The girl described him as a great man whose name deserves to be remembered in history. She said that, frankly speaking, if it were not for him, Korea would not even exist today. The president was always there when help was needed most, and he was a man who undoubtedly deserved his position. Kanzo thought about this for a moment, and now, reflecting on that conversation, he found the president to be a fair, good-natured authority figure. He was exactly the kind of person who could take responsibility for the distribution of his manuscript. If he could really be trusted, then perhaps the president could be trusted with such a secret. Thinking about this, Kanzo decided to take a walk. Meanwhile, the chairman of the Hunters Association walked down the corridor accompanied by his bodyguards. He then entered the elevator heading to the 69th floor. Entering his office, the man greeted the security guard and asked the secretary to bring him a cup of coffee. The chairman settled into his chair, looking through some documents. His gaze fell on a blue notebook with the inscription "Method of a Pure and Righteous Heart." Seeing this, he realized that it was probably related to martial arts, so he turned the notebook over in his hands. The secretary soon brought him coffee, and the chairman thanked him. Then he asked the boy if he knew what kind of notebook it was. The secretary looked through the notebook carefully, and after a moment admitted that he did not know. The chairman guessed that the Pure and Righteous Heart method probably had something to do with martial arts. He casually asked the secretary if he had ever read novels about heroes who found ancient manuscripts that made them stronger. In response, the secretary smiled and replied that if reading books could give such abilities, that would be wonderful indeed. The chairman stroked his beard thoughtfully, intrigued by the contents of the notebook. He began to turn the pages, noting that the handwriting, although not particularly elegant, was energetic. Suddenly something caught his attention and he slammed the notebook shut, only to open it again and become engrossed in reading. As it turns out, Kanzo wrote that the method involves strengthening the connection between the Dantian and the energy core, allowing a person to use their aura without unnecessary losses. This would make awakened people much more effective in combat. The man's brows were furrowed, sweat was breaking out on his forehead, and he was so absorbed in reading his notebook that he barely noticed the secretary bringing another cup of coffee. The chairman continued reading, noting that the author of this method seemed to be explaining that the modern classroom system was outdated, as if the teacher were sitting next to him and guiding him. The author shared his method with humanity free of charge, hoping that it would be used only for the sake of peace and security. The chairman then leaned back in his chair, thinking that scientists all over the world had been studying the possibility of raising the level of awakened people, but no one had found an answer yet. All the research seemed futile. He wondered who could have written something so grandiose. The contents of the notebook were compelling, written at a very high level. And yet he wondered who had brought it here and why. Suddenly, as he turned the page, the president noticed something that made his heart skip a beat, a set of fingerprints. But then he realized that it was more like a symbol. It was the only trace left by an awakened level 0 individual, a rare and mysterious classification. The president thought that perhaps the author of the method was just such a person. If so, then there could be no doubt about the effectiveness of the method or the good intentions of the author. The president tried to maintain hope that this method did not cause him any trouble. The thought of trouble crossed his mind, but he decided that he had no objections. If the method worked as promised, it would be worth it. He remembered that even Leon had encountered difficulties in the area of energy conservation. The president then put the notebook in his breast pocket, muttering to himself that he was now very interested in meeting the author. Especially after reading this method, he decided to contact him immediately. At that moment, one person was approaching the skyscraper where the man was located. Leon walked into the president's office and the president was glad to see him. Knowing how much he hated leaving his home, Leon asked the man what happened. He handed the notebook to Leon, telling him to read it as he believed it contained the answers he had been seeking for so long. Leon flipped through the pages of the notebook, asking where the president had gotten such a tattered thing. Suddenly something caught his attention and he immediately asked about it. The president, pleased with Leon's reaction, replied that he was waiting for exactly that expression on his face. So now his day was a success. Then Leon repeated his question about what it was. The president replied that it was indeed not a very good notebook, but he read the title, The Method of a Pure and Righteous Heart. He smiled and said that Leon had traveled abroad several times to meet with awakened level 0 individuals, asking them how they managed to control their wild energy. In response, Leon muttered that he had only received stupid answers, such as suggestions to undergo a second awakening or be reborn at level 0. But now, looking at this notebook, he felt that this was the real solution to the energy problem. Leon excitedly asked again where the president got the notebook. The president replied that it was a gift from the only awakened level 0 in their country. The president then went on to explain that when he arrived at work that morning, the notebook was already on his desk, the cameras had not picked it up, and its origin remained a mystery. Then Leon clutched the notebook, eager to learn this method. He asked the president if he could test it first. The president agreed, explaining that this was the reason he called him. Even if there were side effects, Leon's S-class abilities would allow him to overcome them. After that, Leon thanked the president, then headed towards the exit. As he left, he raised his head and his thoughts turned to the first awakened level 0 in Korea. He wondered who this mysterious hero could be. After some time, the guy was walking along a busy embankment. He soon stopped as he noticed a bench nearby, wondering if he should take a rest. Leon sat down, raising his hand above his head. The sky was incredibly clear, and looking up, Leon wondered how much time had passed since he left his home. He wondered how long it had been since he had last basked in the sunlight, and felt as carefree as he did now. He remembered how people around him looked at him with awe, calling him a hero. Leon frowned and wiped the blood from his face, thinking about how the crowd was cheering for this newfound cool hero who seemed to come out of nowhere. The news anchor was talking about him. A man named Leon who managed to close an S-class portal. He was the first to do such a feat, but the price was high. His comrades died, and Leon began to fear the very power he possessed. He remembered that from that day on, he lived in constant internal conflict. The more he tried to master his abilities, the more uncontrollable they became, leaving him increasingly isolated. Yet it was precisely because of this strength that many others were able to return to peaceful life. A slight tremor ran through his palm, and Leon's eyes widened when he noticed fresh blood on his hand. Although he continued to live, he never found it easy to bear the weight of his gift. Gritting his teeth, he slapped his palm sharply, then looked at it again, frowning, noting that it was clean. He came to the conclusion that he had not yet perfected this method, and must remain vigilant. For a long time, Leon hated his own strength. And yet, through mastering the pure and righteous heart method, he overcame this hatred and surpassed the limitations of Class 0. He admitted that the Zero Class Awakened who shared this method was indeed his benefactor. Just then he noticed a sudden movement in front of him, and was surprised to see a courier wearing a helmet. Leon watched the man closely, suspecting that his abilities were related to speed, perhaps at least at the B-class level. Meanwhile, the courier unpacked the dishes from his suitcase, noting that they had arrived from the Spring Pavilion restaurant. Then the boy looked down at the dishes the man had brought. Leon's eyes widened, and drool began to flow from his mouth. The young man frowned and typed something into his phone, stating that they absolutely had to visit this establishment. It was nearby after all. Soon the hero returned to the restaurant. Jenny handed him a glass of water. Noting that he had performed impressively today, he gratefully reached for the glass. As he brought it to his mouth, the girl came closer and asked if something had happened to the water. Kanso then looked at the boy in the cap and said that the problem was not the water. Instead, he believed that it was the young man himself whose powerful presence he felt in the park. His aura was overwhelming. Meanwhile, the door of the establishment opened. Leon walked inside with a smile, wishing everyone a good day. Sarah approached him with a smile and asked if he would like to have dinner alone. Leon answered in the affirmative, took off his cap and then asked Jenny what she was doing here. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, recognizing him. Sam, who was standing nearby, smiled and wondered out loud if the man looked familiar. Deep in thought, he put his finger to his lips and remarked that he might have seen him somewhere before. Then Jenny awkwardly spread her hands and declared that the young man was her cousin, adding with a nervous smile that he had such a typical face that people often thought they had seen him somewhere before. She then asked her so-called brother what he would like to eat, and advised him to eat quickly and move on. Leon smiled and pulled out his chair, saying he would have the jjajangmyeon. Then Jenny returned to the table with a tray and handed him a glass of water. She asked what he was doing there and if he was even allowed to leave the house. She pointed out that if he had another outburst of uncontrollable energy, she might be able to handle it, but the others probably couldn't. In response, Leon smiled and raised his hand, indicating that those days were behind him, and Jenny then asked if he had found a solution to his energy problems. Leon simply said that he would find out about it during their next training session at the association. Jenny frowned and clenched her fist, warning him to keep his mouth shut in front of the others, as they considered her to be just an ordinary girl. Just then, Sarah brought him his dish. Since Jenny mentioned that they were related, she increased the portion. Then the guy quietly laughed, noting that he really didn't need to do that. Leon then closed his eyes and brought a piece of noodle to his mouth. After tasting it, he opened his eyes wide and smiled. Even though the noodles were a little burnt in places, they were still delicious. Possibly the best he'd had in a long time. He hadn't had such fresh and well-made jjajangmyeon in ages. Pursing his lips and clenching his fists, he thought that he never expected to enjoy such simple pleasures again. Suddenly, bright streams of energy appeared around his body again. Leon's eyes widened as he imagined the bloody bodies sprawled across the restaurant floor. He jumped to his feet and clenched his fists tightly, realizing that this was serious. His emotions were overflowing, and with them, his aura was spinning out of control, his eyes widening in shock. At that moment, Jenny came up to him and asked if he had finished his meal, since it was time for him to leave. At the same moment, the main character was taking another order from the girl. Leon scratched the back of his head and turned around, unsure of what he had just witnessed. Kanso closed his eyes while Leon watched him closely, knowing that the situation was dangerous. Even though Leon had learned the pure and righteous heart method, he still lacked actual experience. Fortunately, he managed to suppress his energy in time. Kanso furrowed his brows, wondering who this mysterious person could be. It was clear that the stranger had mastered this method exceptionally well, despite Leon only releasing it into the world a few days ago. Considering that he was acquainted with Jenny, this person had to be someone important. Kanso looked at Leon, whose body was once again enveloped in shining energy. He noted to himself that although he was a bit rough, he clearly understood the theory. Perhaps he was even the only S-class talent in the country. Meanwhile, Jenny closed her eyes and asked Leon if he liked the food. If so, it was time for him to leave. Then the guy adjusted his cap and replied that he understood everything. At that moment, the guy's phone rang. Leon put the phone to his ear and answered the chairman's request, assuring him that he would be there soon. After finishing the conversation, he scratched the back of his head, noting to himself that the chairman had called him to a meeting. Jenny, sensing the urgency, urged him to hurry. Then Leon headed towards the front door, saying goodbye to his sister. The girl waved her hand at him, mentioning that they would see each other again, although not in this place. As he walked out, Jenny smiled and waved back, Kanso appearing behind her just as she let out a sigh of visible relief, clutching her hands to her chest and hoping he wouldn't give away her secret. She hesitated for a moment, but quickly pulled herself together, introducing him once again as her cousin, and the young man replied that he understood everything without question. Soon, Leon arrived at the chairman's office and, approaching his desk, asked why he had been called. The chairman motioned for him to come closer and asked if he had already studied this method. Slightly bowing his head, Leon replied that the effect of this method was simply dizzying. The chairman clenched his fist, admitting that despite the remarkable results he had not been overly enthusiastic. Then he asked if Leon had noticed any disturbing aspects of the method. Leon furrowed his brows and raised his hands in front of him, explaining that while he was initially excited, deeper analysis revealed the truth. If this method were made public, it could plunge society into chaos. The chairman leaned back in his chair and admitted that, having realized that the method really worked, he had experienced the same fear, and yet there was something that worried him even more than the side effects. Leon, intrigued, then asked if it was possible that the man was concerned about the intentions of the method's creator. Then he clenched his fist, admitting that he too was afraid of the mysterious figure, although what he felt was not just fear, but a complex mixture of horror and awe. The awakened Class Zero's motives remained shrouded in mystery, and Leon couldn't help but wonder what was really behind them. Meanwhile, Molly sat at her desk in the office, immersed in her work. Her colleague extended his hand to offer her a cup of coffee, and smiled as he noted that she probably needed it. Because of how tired she was, she accepted the cup with a grateful smile. The young man, looking at her again, noticed that she had stayed out late again, and asked, slightly teasingly, if she was drowning in work again. Molly smiled awkwardly and admitted that it was true. She closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her forehead, admitting that the illegal awakenings had been becoming more and more active lately. Morty, her colleague, frowned and nodded in agreement, adding that he had also heard rumors that the suicide bomber was becoming bolder. The girl bowed her head, complaining that the investigators were under a lot of stress because of this man. Molly's frown deepened, pointing out that the support department was also overloaded with work due to the recent assassination attempt on Black Rose. She looked at Morty questioningly, asking if he was in a hurry himself and if he had come all this way just to bring her coffee. With a weak smile, Morty replied that he had actually brought something else. He asked if Molly was free next Thursday night. When she asked him what he meant, he reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 tickets, and said that he had managed to get seats for the Golden Star Ballet and hoped that if she was free, she would join him. In response, Molly winked playfully, noting that it sounded tempting, and asked if he really wanted to go to the ballet with her instead of his girlfriend. Morty then placed his hand on the table and smiled warmly, asking his sister not to be like that. With a small laugh, she finally relented, saying that if her little brother asked, then she couldn't refuse. The young man pointed to the calendar on her desk and asked her to mark the date so that she would not forget. Molly smiled and picked up the calendar, circled the 18th in red, and asked if her brother was happy now. Morty smiled back, gently extending his hand to her and telling her that he would now restore her powers before setting off, bright streams of energy beginning to swirl around the girl's body. Molly closed her eyes, smiling with a quiet serenity. When she opened them slightly, she stretched and said that her thoughts were finally clear. She thanked him, and he reminded her to take care of herself. When Thursday came, the family was in the spring pavilion preparing for the ballet. Sam, dressed in a light suit, standing next to Kanso, dressed in a darker one. Hannah, in a flowing pink dress, came down the stairs, radiating excitement. She raised her arms and twirled, asking her father and uncle if she was pretty. Sam smiled and closed his eyes, telling her that she was a real beauty. Kanso chuckled and added that she was an absolute cutie. Sarah appeared from around the corner in her business suit, smiling and noting that her husband looked quite respectable that evening. Sam rubbed the back of his head sheepishly, then smiled and leaned away, suggesting that she admire Kanso instead. Hannah spread her hands, declaring that her uncle was practically a celebrity today. Kanso, dressed in a black suit and tie, smiled, expressing his gratitude for the kind words. Then Sam rubbed his chin and admitted that he had a strange feeling about the evening. When asked what he meant, he fell silent. Sarah smiled and explained that they were concerned about the attention he was getting with his striking appearance. Kanso adjusted his sleeve and thanked him for the compliment. Then Sam cleared his throat and pointed towards the exit, indicating that it was time to leave. As they stepped outside, several girls couldn't help but glance at the hero, enchanted by his presence. Sam smiled sheepishly, realizing that Kanso inevitably attracted attention wherever he went. Kanso, however, frowned. Something was wrong. Despite the elegance and openness of the venue, he felt the same dark energy that lurked in the dungeons. He raised an eyebrow, startled by the intensity of the gaze he felt was fixed on him. The hero turned around, scanning the street for a source of energy, his gaze stopping on a girl in a long red dress standing at the entrance. Jenny, avoiding his gaze, nervously rubbed her neck, her eyes widening in surprise, and a blush coloring her cheeks when she saw her colleague in a suit. The young man smiled to himself, thinking that he had expected to see her here. He crossed his arms over his chest and closed his eyes, wondering if he should tell her what he felt. He suspected that there were illegal awakened presence somewhere nearby. However, if he were to admit it to her, he wouldn't be able to explain it. It was impossible for someone of Class F to feel such things. She would understand that he was a Class 0, and he wasn't ready to reveal this truth. At this point, it was wiser to gather more evidence. Meanwhile, the fair-haired man who was in the building nearby smiled widely and let out a light chuckle. Sitting down and crossing his legs, he advised his companions to enjoy themselves. After all, this might just be the last ballet of their lives. The girl standing next to him bowed respectfully, offering Mr. Asmod an exclusive wine in honor of the occasion. The man rubbed his chin and raised his glass, noting that the blood-red wine was exactly what he needed. Asmod stood facing a group of people dressed in black suits. He asked if everyone was ready. The men responded with a bow, confirming that they were ready. Then Asmod rose to his feet, explaining that during the second act Clara would dance with the prince, after which their magical performance would begin, all at his will. The group repeated the phrase in unison with unwavering determination. Then the man grabbed the hilt of his sword and swung it through the air, leaving behind bright streams of energy. After this, Asmod smiled, stating that it was time for them to leave. Soon they found themselves on the roof, Asmod of them crossing his arms over his chest and noting that the view from there would be impressive, because from this vantage point they would witness the explosion of the concert hall. His assistant asked him, not believing her ears, what he meant. Suddenly Asmod's eyes widened. A chill ran down his spine. Turning around, he noticed Kanso standing nearby. The hero clasped his hands behind his back and greeted him. Then Asmod asked who he was. Kanso, casually shaking his hand and coming closer, admitted that he didn't want to spoil anyone's mood, but hoped that they would cooperate. Then the blonde frowned, asking what the stranger meant. Asmod followed suit, raising his fists and challenging the newcomer, asking if he even understood who he was standing in front of. Without hesitation, Kanso stepped closer and delivered a powerful blow straight into Asmod's stomach, throwing the man back, leaving the girl frozen in shock. Kanso dusted off his hands, noting to himself that in all worlds, seemingly civilized conversation was often mistaken for weakness, and that language alone often led to men's deaths. Then Kanso urged the man to stop pretending and stand up. He then mused out loud that he hadn't hit him that hard. And yet Asmod had been so shocked. Asmod staggered back to his feet, clearly confused, and demanded to know if Kanso really understood who he was. Kanso calmly put his hands behind his back and asked who exactly he claimed to be. Asmod answered majestically, declaring himself great and powerful. At that moment, the protagonist's body began to be surrounded by blinding energy. Asmod blinked in confusion, wondering why he still couldn't clearly see Kanso's face. Kanso, however, remained unperturbed, saying that he didn't care who Asmod was. What really mattered was why he needed the concert hall. At that moment, a girl approached Asmod, and the blonde calmly said that a bomb had been planted in the hall. Asmod smiled widely and confirmed this, explaining that the bomb was planted in one of the support columns. When it exploded, every last pathetic insect in the building would perish. Then Kanso turned to the girl and asked if her subordinate was telling the truth. Asmod pointed at her in shock, claiming that he was her boss. Kanso then smiled faintly and disputed the claim, suggesting that it might not be true, and wondering if it was time to end this farce. The girl's eyes widened. She smiled slightly and admitted that he had a keen intuition. She turned to look at Asmod, who was now kneeling, and asked loudly if it was really time to end this. She admitted that she was tired of playing the role of secretary. Asmod stood up and frowned deeply, clenching his fists. He demanded to know what she meant. Without hesitation, the girl reached out, piercing his chest, blood dripping from her fingers. She smiled coldly and took his sword, stating that this artifact, like the name Asmod, was never meant for him. Asmod clutched his chest in disbelief, demanding to know what she was doing. Then she placed the sword on his shoulder and gently told him to sleep, after which Asmod collapsed to the ground. Kanso watched the girl closely and asked who she really was. She smiled and raised her sword, finally revealing that she was the true Asmod. Kanso's eyes widened, and he asked if this meant that she was behind the terrorist attack. Then he lunged at her. The hero swung his fist, but the girl's body disappeared, dissipating like fog. Kanso frowned and looked away, concluding that it must have been an illusion spell. Suddenly Asmod appeared behind him again. Smiling, she noted that he was fast. Kanso turned to her and asked if she was even human. She playfully responded by placing her hand on her cheek, and asked if it was proper to ask such things to a girl. Smiling, she raised her sword and stated that her name would remain a secret. Perhaps next time she would introduce herself properly. She swung her blade in a wide arc, leaving a glowing trail in the air. Then she sheathed the weapon, lamenting that she would miss a great show because of it. However, she decided to forgive him, because, as she admitted with a grin, he was her type. With that, Asmod stepped into the glowing portal, promising to see him again. However, her confident step faltered, her eyes widening in confusion as the portal began to warp. The bright stream of energy took on an unusual shape, and she froze in place, unable to understand why the portal created by her artifact was distorted. Kanso raised his hand and calmly asked if she really believed he would let her go so easily, a radiant energy enveloping his body as he stepped forward. He noted that her ability to cut through space was interesting, but mentioned that he had a solution. He would simply stitch the space back together. The energy raging behind him became even more intense. Asmod stared at him, not believing her eyes, realizing that he was much more dangerous than she had imagined. Then Kanso waved his hand, cutting through the dark streams of energy and leaving a bright scar in the air. At that moment, Asmod was enveloped in dark energy. She decided that her only way out was to take an ethereal form and escape. Kanso then raised his fist and shouted, asking how much longer she intended to dodge him. He punched again, but her body disappeared, leaving behind wisps of shadow. Asmod wrapped her arms around herself, thinking that the situation was dire. Even in her incorporeal form, she could still feel his blows. Her time was running out. Her eyes widened in horror as the remaining dark energy ran out. It was too late. If she had been at least a class stronger, this wouldn't have happened. Kanso, unperturbed, prepared for a new attack. Raising his knee, he delivered a powerful kick to her shoulder, sending her flying with a cry of pain, Asmod hitting the ground hard. As he approached her, the hero noticed a pool of black blood and noted to himself that she could not possibly be human. Then he loudly asked if she was a demoness in the guise of a woman. Asmod grabbed her shoulder, gritting her teeth in pain, and thought darkly that this situation had turned into a nightmare. There was no escape from it now. Her gaze darted to the hilt of her sword, thinking that she might have to resort to this method. Meanwhile, Kanso studied her. Her aura was so unusual that he couldn't help but wonder who she really was. Asmod smiled weakly and asked if he would spare her if she told him everything. Kanso put his hands behind his back and asked if she was really begging for mercy. She dropped to one knee, insisting that she would never ask for such a thing. Instead, she raised her hand and drew a sharp blade, and with unwavering determination, she plunged the tip of the sword into her chest. Kanso's expression darkened, and he silently admitted to himself that he hadn't expected this, that she would rather die than reveal her true identity. Dark streams of energy began to swirl around her body. Asmod watched this phenomenon with a thoughtful smile, suspecting that perhaps he was finally beginning to understand what was really going on. Her yellow eyes widened as she took a step back and said goodbye to the man, clearly hoping that their paths would never cross again. Kanso turned his attention to the dark energy, admitting to himself that he had never encountered such an ability before. He decided it would be better to suppress it first and ask questions later. His gaze moved to the man lying on the floor, who weakly extended his hand, accusing the girl of betrayal and swearing that one day she would take revenge. Then Kanso calmly convinced him to reveal their plan. The man, frowning, said that during the performance of Clara and the Prince, a bomb was planted that was supposed to explode. He mentioned that there was a pyrokinetic in the audience before his hand fell lifelessly to the floor. Meanwhile, dancers graced the stage, performing a dance under the soft light of stage lights. Hannah, who was watching from her seat, widened her eyes in awe at the beauty of the performance. Sarah smiled and explained that next would be the Waltz of the Flowers, followed by the grand event, the dance of Clara and the Prince. Meanwhile, Leon, dressed in formal attire, leaned toward his companions, asking if there really would be a dance in the next act. At the same time, Leon frowned. His thoughts were consumed with finding out the identity of the person who had entered his office earlier. That person had left a message about the presence of illegals in the Myeongsan concert hall, and disappeared without a trace. Although the chairman had no idea where the stranger had gotten such information, He couldn't shake the feeling that it was probably accurate. His boss handed him a piece of paper with instructions to gather a squad of law enforcement officers and go to the scene. He assured him that there would be no problems. Leon studied the paper, his thoughts agreeing with the growing sense of aura that he was beginning to feel. According to the diagram, the source appeared to be coming from the technical floor, and he then announced that their first priority was to evacuate civilians. As one of the operatives threw open the doors and announced an emergency evacuation, calling for everyone to leave immediately, Leon selected 2 officers to escort him to the basement. As they walked down the stairs, he remembered how the association's director had provided them with the blueprints for the building, a gesture that had sped up their search considerably. Leon mentally noted that he would have to thank him later. In the dark corridor, a man in a suit stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his body radiating dark energy. Leon cautiously approached, sensing the suspicious aura emitted by this man. The man then addressed the squad, stating that access to the area was prohibited, and politely insisted that they leave, regardless of who they were. In response, Leon simply smiled and raised his fist, questioning the ban.